So do you think death, mortality is fundamental to an agent? So like there's I don't know if you're familiar, there's a philosopher named Ernest Becker who wrote the Denial of Death. And his whole idea, and there's folks, psychologists, cognitive scientists that work on terror management theory, and they think that one of the special things about humans is that we're able to sort of foresee our death, right? We can realize, not just as animals do, sort of constantly fear in an instinctual sense, respond to all the dangers that are out there, but like understand that this ride ends eventually.
Yeah.
And that in itself is the force behind all of the creative efforts of human nature.
Yeah.
That's the philosophy.
I think that makes sense. A lot of sense. I mean, animals probably don't think of death the same way, but humans know that your time is limited and you want to make it count. And you can make it count in many different ways, but I think that has a lot to do with creativity and the need for humans to do something beyond just surviving. And now going from that simple definition to something that's the next level, I think that could be the second decision, a second level of definition, that intelligence means something that you do something that stays behind you, that's more than your existence. Something you create something that is useful for others, is useful in the future, not just for yourself. And I think that's a nice definition of intelligence in a next level. And it's also nice because it doesn't require that they are humans or biological. They could be artificial agents that are intelligent. They could achieve those kind of goals.
So a particular agent, the ripple effects of their existence on the entirety of the system is significant. So like they leave a trace where there's like ripple effects. But see, then you go back to the butterfly with the flap of a wing, and then you can trace a lot of like nuclear wars and all the conflicts of human history somehow connected to that one butterfly that created all of the chaos. So maybe that's not. Maybe that's a very poetic way to think. That's something we humans, in a human-centric way, want to hope we have this impact. Like that is the secondary effect of our intelligence. We've had a long-lasting impact on the world, but maybe the entirety of physics in the universe has a very long-lasting effect.
Sure, but you can also think of it, what if, like The Wonderful Life, what if you're not here? Will somebody else do this? Is it something that you actually contributed because you had something unique to contribute? That's a pretty high bar, though.
Uniqueness.
Yeah. So, you have to be Mozart or something to actually reach that level. That nobody would have developed that, but other people might have solved this equation if you didn't do it. But also within limited scope. I mean, during your lifetime or next year, you could contribute something that unique that other people did not see, and then that could change the way things move forward for a while. So I don't think we have to be Mozarts to be called intelligence, but we have this local effect that is changing. If you weren't there, that would not have happened, and it's a positive effect. Of course, you want it to be a positive effect.
Do you think it's possible to engineer in to computational agents a fear of mortality? Like, does that make any sense? So there's a very trivial thing where it's like you could just code in a parameter, which is how long the life ends, but more of a fear of mortality, like awareness of the way that things end, and somehow encoding a complex representation of that fear, which is like maybe as it gets closer, you become more terrified. I mean, there seems to be something really profound about this fear that's not currently encodable in a trivial way into our programs.
Well, I think you're referring to the emotion of fear, something, because cognitively we know that we have limited lifespan, and most of us cope with it by just, hey, that's what the world is like, and I make the most of it. But sometimes you can have a fear that's not healthy, that paralyzes you, that you can't do anything, and somewhere in between there, not caring at all and getting paralyzed because of fear, is a normal response, which is a little bit more than just logic and it's emotion. So now the question is, what good are emotions? I mean, they are quite complex, and there are multiple dimensions of emotions, and they probably do serve a survival function. Heightened focus, for instance, and fear of death might be a really good emotion when you are in danger, that you recognize it, even if it's not logically necessarily easy to derive, and you don't have time for that logical deduction. You may be able to recognize the situation is dangerous, and this fear kicks in, and you all of a sudden perceive the facts that are important for that. And I think that's generally is the role of emotions. It allows you to focus what's relevant for your situation. And maybe if fear of death plays the same kind of role, but if it consumes you and it's something that you think in normal life when you don't have to, then it's not healthy and then it's not productive.
Yeah, but it's fascinating to think how to incorporate emotion into a computational agent. It almost seems like a silly statement to make, but it perhaps seems silly because we have such a poor understanding of the mechanism of emotion, of fear, of... I think at the core of it is another word that we know nothing about, but say a lot, which is consciousness.
Yeah.
Are you yourself afraid of death?
No.
Do you think about it? Does it make sense to you that this thing ends? Like, do you, the Stoics contemplated death. It gives flavor to life. It makes you appreciate. There's something about finiteness of life that makes it this Jocko Discipline Go drink, sour apple that I'm enjoying is delicious. Makes it taste better because I'm going to die one day. And I think about that a lot. Do you think about it?
Other than I know that it's going to end. I mean, but I don't think about it on a daily basis. I think about...
It's just a fact.
I know that I'm lucky to be here. I know that many people sacrificed to give me this opportunity to be here. So, but I don't dwell on it.
What about when you were in combat? Nothing. There's tactics, there's strategy, there's the mission, and then your mortality is not part of the calculation.
I think you get to a point where you accept the fact that you can die. Like like I said, you can do everything right. You roll out the gate, you hit an IED, a triple stack subsurface IED, and you're dead. You're done. And there's nothing that's going to stop that. It's going to happen. And I think if you're scared of that or you're thinking about that, it's going to inhibit your ability to do your job properly. And I think it's also going to drive you crazy. The thing that I thought about more was that happening to my guys. And that's the gut-wrenching terror that you feel when operations happen.
Can I ask you about love of country? It continues to... Just how much I've studied Stalin recently in the past few years, it continues to surprise me. Not surprise me. It's just tragic in some kind of way. I'm not sure exactly if I could put words to it, but how many people, and still do, but at the time loved Stalin and were willing to die for country, for the love of country. And I too, maybe because I was born there, and now I am a red-blooded American. I love, nationalism is a bad word, but I love the love of country. It somehow gives meaning, like a brotherhood, like we're in this together. That's why I love the Olympics. That's just the unity of it. It takes a step out of the selfish pursuits of any one particular ant and looks at us as a big ant colony. And it's inspiring, it's exciting, but at the same time, it seems to get us to do horrible things if manipulated by charismatic leaders. What do you make of this love of country? Is it a bad thing? Is it a thing that gets in the way? Or is it a good thing?
Well, I think like anything else, if it's balanced correctly, it's great. And if it goes to some extreme level, then it becomes a negative. And I think it's probably sourced in some sort of animalistic tribalism that we all have to be part of a tribe. And this is a real big tribe that you get to be a part of. And all you have to do is kind of show up. And so when someone says, hey, we're going to play hockey against the Russians, well, we're going to cheer for the American boys.
You know, I feel that sense of terror every time. Jack Kerouac talked about this on the road. Is, you know, when you leave a place, if you're honest about it, like, life is short. And when you leave a place, you move to a new place, and you think of all the friends, maybe family you're leaving behind as you drive over the hill. That really is goodbye. Like, we sometimes don't think of it that way when we're moving, but that really is goodbye to that life, to the person you were, to all the people. Maybe if it's close friends, you'll see them maybe 10, 15 more times in your life, and that's it. Yeah. And you're saying goodbye to all of that. And so in the same way, I see it as way more dramatic when you're flying away from Earth, and it's like, it's goodbye to Dunkin' Donuts and Starbucks, and it's goodbye to whatever. I don't know why I picked those, but all the things that are special to Earth, it's goodbye. But that's life. I suppose more what excites me about that kind of journey is it's a distinct contemplation of your mortality, acceptance of your mortality. You're saying, just like when you take on any difficult journey, it's accepting that you're going to die one day, and might as well do something truly exciting.
Yeah, I mean, I'm with you on that. I'm a strong believer that deep underneath human motivation is this terror of our own mortality. You know, there's this wonderful book that had a great influence on me called The Denial of Death by Ernest Becker. And when you are aware of the ways in which our mortality influences our behaviors, it really does add a different slant, a different kind of color to the interpretation of human behavior.
Yeah, it's funny. That book had a big influence on me as well.
Oh, is that right? Wow.
And terror management theory, and I, again, from an engineering perspective, I don't know how many people that book influenced, because I talk to people about the fear of death, and it doesn't seem to be that fundamental to their experience. And I don't think on the surface it's fundamental to my experience, but it seems like an awfully, in terms of, we talk about models and string theory and theories, in terms of theories of this macro experience of human life, it seems like a heck of a good theory that the fear of death is is the worm at the core.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and the terror management theories that you make reference to, I mean, this is a group of, psychologists, social psychologists who devise these very clever experiments, real world experiments with real people, where you can directly measure the hidden influence of the recognition of our own mortality. I mean, they've done these experiments where they have group of people A, group of people B, and the only difference between the two groups is that group B, they somehow reminded them in some subtle way of their own mortality. Sometimes it's nothing more than interviewing them with a funeral home across the street. An influence is there, but it's subtle. You don't even think you take note of. And they can find measurable effects that differentiate the two groups to a high degree of statistical significance in how they respond to certain challenges or certain kinds of questions that shows a direct influence of the reminder of their own mortality. And I've read a number of these studies, and they are really convincing. And so, I would say that the reason why so many people would say that, fear of mortality is not front and center in my worldview. I don't really think about it much. It doesn't really matter to me much. The reason why they're able to say that is because this thing called culture has emerged over the course of the last 10,000 years. Yeah. And part of the role of culture is to give us a means of not thinking about our mortality all the time, of not living in terror of the inevitable end which faces us all. So it's completely understandable that that's the response, because that's what culture is, at least in part, for.
It's at least possible that the fear of death, the terror of your mortality, is the creative force that created all of the things around us at this human civilization.
Yeah, well,
and I think about, from an engineering perspective, this is where I lose all of my robotics colleagues, is I feel like if you want to create intelligence, you have to also engineer in some kind of echoes of this kind of fear of, and not, fear is such a complicated word, but kind of like a scarcity of time, a scarcity of resources that creates a kind of anxiety. Like deadlines get you to do stuff.
Yeah.
And there's something almost fundamental to that in terms of human experience.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting thought. So you're basically, in order to create a kind of structure that mirrors what we call consciousness,
Yes,
you'd better have that structure confront the same kinds of issues and terrors that we do.
Consciousness and suffering only makes sense in the context of death. If you want to, I feel like, if you want to fit into human society, if you're a robot and if you want to fit into human society, you better have the same kind of existential dread, the same kind of fear of mortality.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're not going to fit in. It might be wild, but it's at least, like, we're talking about all the theories that are at least worth consideration. I think that's a really powerful one, and definitely one has resonated with me, and definitely seems to capture something beautifully, like, real about the human condition. And I wonder, it's, of course, sucks to think that we need death to appreciate life. But that just may be the way it is.
Well, it's interesting, if this robotic or artificially intelligent system understands the world and understands the second law of thermodynamics and entropy, even an artificial intelligence will realize that even if its parts are really robust, ultimately it will disintegrate.
Yeah.
I mean, so the timescales may be different, but in a way, when you think about it, it doesn't matter. Once you know that you are mortal in the sense that you are not eternal, the timescale hardly matters, because it's either the whole thing or not. Because on the scales of eternity, any finite duration, however large, is effectively zero on the scales of eternity. And so maybe it won't be so hard for an artificial system to feel that sense of mortality, because it will recognize the underlying physical laws and recognize its own finitude.
And then it'll be us and robots drinking beers, looking up at the stars, and just, having a good laugh in awe of the whole thing.
Yeah.
I think that's a pretty good way to end it, talking about the fear of death. We started talking about the meaning of life and ended on the fear of death. Brian, it's just an incredible conversation.
My pleasure. Thank you. I enjoyed it enormously.
Really, really enjoyed it. It's been a long time coming. I'm a huge fan of your work, a huge fan of your writing. Thanks for talking today, Brian.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this conversation with Brian Greene. To support this podcast, please check out our sponsors in the description. And now, let me leave you with some words from Bill Bryson. Physics is really nothing more than a search for ultimate simplicity. But so far, all we have is a kind of elegant messiness. Thank you for listening, and hope to see you next time. Why do you think people are so afraid, at least in popular culture, of legged robots like those worked in Boston Dynamics, or just robotics in general? If you were to psychoanalyze that fear, what do you make of it? And should they be afraid? Sorry.
So should people be afraid? I don't think people should be afraid, but with a caveat. I don't think people should be afraid, given that most of us in this world understand that we need to change something, right? So given that, now if things don't change, be very afraid.
Which is the dimension of change that's needed?
So changing, thinking about the ramifications, thinking about like the ethics, thinking about like the conversation is going on, right? It's no longer we're going to deploy it and forget that, this is a car that can kill pedestrians that are walking across the street, right? We're not in that stage. We're putting these roads out. There are people out there.
Yes.
A car could be a weapon. Like, people are now, solutions aren't there yet, but people are thinking about this as we need to be ethically responsible as we send these systems out, robotics, medical, self-driving.
And military, too.
And military.
Which is not as often talked about, but it's really where probably these robots will have a significant impact as well.
Correct. Right. Making sure that they can think rationally, even having the conversations, who should pull the trigger, right?
But overall, you're saying if we start to think more and more as a community about these ethical issues, people should not be afraid.
Yeah, I don't think people should be afraid. I think that the return on investment, the impact, positive impact, will outweigh any of the potentially negative impacts.
Do you ponder your mortality? Are you afraid of death?
I do think about it sometimes. I mean, it does pop into my head sometimes. Just the fact that, I'm 53. So if everything goes great, I have less than 50 years left. If everything goes great, like no car accidents, no injuries.
But it could happen today. This could be your last day.
Could be.
That's kind of a stoic thing, to meditate on death. There's a bunch of philosophers, Ernest Becker and Sheldon Solomon. They believe that death is at the core of everything. Wrote this book, Warm at the Core. So does that come into play in the way you see the world?
I think having a sense of urgency is very beneficial, and understanding that your time is limited can aid you greatly. I think knowing that this is a temporary time, that we have finite lifespans, I think there's great power in that, because it motivates you, it gets you going. I think being an immortal, living forever, would be one of the most depressing things, particularly if everybody else was dying around you. And I think one of the things that makes life so interesting and fascinating is that it doesn't last. That you really get a brief amount of time here. And really, by the time you're just starting to kind of figure yourself out, who you are and how not to screw things up so bad, it's like time's up.
Because the usual dreams that people have when you create a super intelligent system past the singularity, that what people imagine is somehow always destructive. If you were put on your psychology hat, why is it so appealing to imagine the ways that all of human civilization will be destroyed?
I think it's a good story. It's a good story. And very interestingly, it mirrors religious stories, right? Religious mythology. If you look at the mythology of most civilizations, it's about the world being headed towards some final event in which the world will be destroyed and some new world order will arise that will be mostly spiritual, like the apocalypse, followed by paradise, probably, right?
Yeah.
It's a very appealing story on a fundamental level. And we all need stories. We all need stories to structure the way we see the world, especially at timescales that are beyond our ability to make predictions, right?
So on a more serious, non-exponential explosion question, you've written the op-ed in the New York Times titled, "We Shouldn't Be Scared by Superintelligent AI." And it criticized a little bit Stuart Russell and Nick Bostrom. Can you try to summarize that article's key ideas?
So it was spurred by an earlier New York Times op-ed by Stuart Russell, which was summarizing his book called Human Compatible. And the article was saying, if we have super intelligent AI, we need to have its values aligned with our values, and it has to learn about what we really want. And he gave this example: what if we have a super intelligent AI and we give it the problem of solving climate change, and it decides that the best way to lower the carbon in the atmosphere is to kill all the humans?
Right.
Okay. So to me, that just made no sense at all, because a super intelligent AI, first of all, trying to figure out what superintelligence means. And it seems that something that's super intelligent can't just be intelligent along this one dimension of, okay, I'm going to figure out all the steps, the best optimal path to solving climate change, and not be intelligent enough to figure out that humans don't want to be killed, that you could get to one without having the other. And, Bostrom in his book talks about the orthogonality hypothesis, where he says he thinks that a system's, I can't remember exactly what it is, but like a system's goals and its values don't have to be aligned. There's some orthogonality there, which didn't make any sense to me.
So you're saying in any system that's sufficiently not even super intelligent, but as it approaches greater and greater intelligence, there's a holistic nature that will sort of a tension that will naturally emerge that prevents it from sort of any one dimension running away.
Yeah, exactly. So Bostrom had this example of the super intelligent AI that turns the world into paper clips because its job is to make paper clips or something. And that just, as a thought experiment, didn't make any sense to me.
Well, as a thought experiment or as a thing that could possibly be realized?
Either. So I think that, what my op-ed was trying to do was say that intelligence is more complex than these people are presenting it. That it's not so separable. The rationality, the values, the emotions, all of that it's the view that you could separate all these dimensions and build a machine that has one of these dimensions and it's super intelligent in one dimension, but it doesn't have any of the other dimensions. That's what I was trying to criticize, that I don't believe that.
So can I read a few sentences from Yoshua Benja, who's always super eloquent. So he writes, I have the same impression as Melanie that our cognitive biases are linked with our ability to learn to solve many problems. They may also be a limiting factor for AI. However, this is a may, in quotes. Things may also turn out differently, and there's a lot of uncertainty about the capabilities of future machines. But more importantly for me, the value alignment problem is a problem well before we reach some hypothetical superintelligence. It is already posing a problem in the form of super powerful companies whose objective function may not be sufficiently aligned with humanity's general well-being, creating all kinds of harmful side effects. So he goes on to argue that the orthogonality and those kinds of things, the concerns of just aligning values with the capabilities of the system is something that might come long before we reach anything like super intelligence. So your criticism is kind of really nicely saying this idea of super intelligent systems seem to be dismissing fundamental parts of what intelligence would take. And then Yoshua kind of says, yes, but if we look at systems that are much less intelligent, there might be these same kinds of problems that emerge.
Sure. But I guess the example that he gives there of these corporations, that's people, right? Those are people's values. I mean, we're talking about people. The corporations their values are the values of the people who run those corporations.
But the idea is the algorithm. That's right. So the fundamental person, the fundamental element of what does the bad thing is a human being.
Yeah.
But the algorithm kind of controls the behavior of this mass of human beings.
Which algorithm?
For a company that's so for example, if it's an advertisement-driven company that recommends certain things and encourages engagement, so sort of it gets money by encouraging engagement, and therefore the company more and more, it's like the cycle that builds an algorithm that
enforces more engagement and maybe perhaps more division in the culture and so on, so on.
I guess the question here is sort of who has the agency. So you might say, for instance, we don't want our algorithms to be racist.
Right.
And facial recognition, some people have criticized some facial recognition systems as being racist because they're not as good on darker skin than lighter skin.
That's right.
Okay, but the agency there, the actual facial recognition algorithm isn't what has the agency. It's not the racist thing, right? It's the I don't know, the combination of the training data, the cameras being used, whatever. But my understanding of, and I would say I agree with Bengio there that he, I think there are these value issues with our use of algorithms. But my understanding of what Russell's argument is more that the algorithm, the machine itself has the agency now. It's the thing that's making the decisions, and it's the thing that has what we would call values.
Yes.
So whether that's just a matter of degree, it's hard to say, right? But I would say that's sort of qualitatively different than a face recognition neural network.
And to broadly linger on that point, if you look at Elon Musk or Stuart Russell or Bostrom, people who are worried about existential risks of AI, however far into the future, their argument goes is it eventually happens. We don't know how far, but it eventually happens. Do you share any of those concerns? And what kind of concerns in general do you have about AI that approach anything like existential threat to humanity?
So I would say, yes, it's possible. But I think there's a lot more closer in existential threats to humanity.
Because you said like 100 years so your time.
It's more than 100 years.
More than 100 years. And so that means
maybe even more than 500 years. I don't know. I mean, it's.
So the existential threats are so far out that the future there'll be a million different technologies that we can't even predict now that will fundamentally change the nature of our behavior, reality, society, and so on before then.
I think so. And, we have so many other pressing existential threats going on.
Nuclear
right
weapons,
now.
even. And
nuclear weapons, climate problems, poverty, possible pandemics. You can go on and on. And I think, though, worrying about existential threat from AI is not the best priority for what we should be worried about. That's kind of my view, because we're so far away. But I'm not necessarily criticizing Russell or Bostrom or whoever for worrying about that. And I think it's some people should be worried about it. It's certainly fine. But I was more sort of getting at their view of what intelligence is.
mm-hmm.
So I was more focusing on like their view of the superintelligence than just the fact of them worrying. And the title of the article was written by the New York Times editors. I wouldn't have called it that.
We shouldn't be scared by superintelligent AI.
No.
If you wrote it, it'd be like, we should redefine what you mean by superintelligent.
I actually said something like superintelligence is not is not a sort of coherent idea. But that's not like something the New York Times would put in.
And the follow-up argument that Yoshio makes, also not argument but a statement, and I've heard him say it before, and I think I agree. He's kind of has a very friendly way of phrasing it as it's good for a lot of people to believe different things.
He's such a nice guy.
Yeah, well, no, but it's also practically speaking, like we shouldn't be like, while your article stands, like Stuart Russell does amazing work, Bostrom does amazing work, you do amazing work, and even when you disagree about the definition of superintelligence or the usefulness of even the term, it's still useful to have people that like use that term.
right? And then argue. It's
Sure. I absolutely agree with Benjo there. And I think it's great that, and it's great that the New York Times will publish all this stuff. So.
That's right. It's an exciting time to be. So,
Yeah.
let me ask you about the ultimate down, which is, unfortunately, we humans are mortal, or appear to be, for the most part. Do you think about your own mortality? Do you fear death?
I hope so. And I do. Because, without death, there is no life. So at least there is no meaningful life. Death is actually, in some sense, our ultimate motivator to live a beautiful and meaningful life. I myself felt as a young man that unless I gotten something that I wanted to do, I don't know why I got this idea that I had something to say. If I'm not able to say, I would suicide. So maybe it was a way to motivate myself. But you don't need to motivate it because, in some sense, fortunately, death is there. So you better get up and do your thing, and because that is the best motivation to live fully.
Well, what do you think? What do you hope your legacy is?
You
mentioned you have 2 kids.
Yes. And so I really feel that, there is, on one side is my biological legacy, and that is my 2 kids, right? And their kids, hopefully. And that is one fine. And the other thing is this common enterprise, which is society. And I really feel that my legacy would be better by providing security and privacy. Actually, for me, are metaphorical to say I want to give you the ability to interact more and take more risks and reach out more for more people, as difficult and dangerous as it may seem. But my whole scientific work is about to guarantee privacy and give you the security of interaction. And not only in a transaction, like it would be a blockchain transaction, but that is really one of the hardcore of my emotional problems. And I think that, these are the problems I want to tackle.
Yeah, and ultimately, privacy and security is freedom. And
yes.
Freedom is at the core of this. It's dangerous. It's like the emotion thing.
The emotion thing, yeah.
But ultimately, that's how we create all the beautiful things. So we talked quite a bit about the definitions of religion and what are the different building blocks of religion. So one of the, I don't think we touched on, we did a little bit with the afterlife, but in the sense, I don't know if you're familiar with the Ernest Becker work and all the philosophies around there about the fear of death and how a fear of our own mortality, or awareness of our own mortality and its fear is, in case of Ernest Becker, is a significant component in the psychology, in the way we humans develop our understanding of the world. So what are your thoughts in the context of religion, or maybe in the context of your own mind, about the role of death in life, or fear of death in life? And are you afraid of death? Diana,
we cover everything in this podcast.
Every single topic is covered.
Wow. Okay. I so happen to have benefited, perhaps, from living with an older brother who seemingly had no fear of death while growing up. And he did everything. Okay. So he climbed mountains. He was a rock climber. He jumped out of airplanes. Of course, he had to be a Green Beret and go into the special forces where that type of thing is a requirement, right? And so because of that, I did a lot of things outside of my comfort zone, and which probably I shouldn't have done. And hope to goodness my kids don't do them.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So do I fear death? I think about death a lot, actually. You may not know this about me, but in my field, I was the co-chair of the death panel. It's called the death panel. No, it's the panel to think about death in religious studies. And I was that for many years.
So you've thought about it a bit.
A bit. Let's see. I think that people are a little too confident, I think, about life in general, that they're going to kind of live all the time and not die. I hate to say it, I'm super positive, and most people would consider me to be too happy almost, right? And so it's odd then that I spend a lot of time thinking about death, but I wonder if there's a connection there.
Yeah.
I'm happy to be alive, right?
Yeah, that's kind of what the thinking about death does, is it makes you appreciate the days that you do have.
Yeah.
It's a weird controversy. I tend to believe that the fact that this life ends gives each day a significant amount of meaning. So I don't know. It seems like an important feature of life. It's not like a bug. It seems like a feature that it ends. But it's a strange feature, because I wish it, like all the good stuff, you wish it wouldn't end.
Well, you know what's interesting, Lex, and I do point this out to my students, because we cover, in a lot of the basic studies courses I teach, we cover all religions, or as many as we can, like the major religions. And so take Hinduism, for example. Now, this is an ancient religion, okay? So you and I are here talking about how we enjoy living and life and things like that. Well, the goal of Hinduism is basically never to get reincarnated again. It's basically to not live, okay? Yeah. And to get off samsara, which is the wheel of life and death.
Yeah.
So
escape the whole
Yeah, exactly.
thing.
Think of that. Conditions are so different that you and I and my students are happy to be alive. But they're back in the day, thousands of years ago, when they actually didn't write it, they spoke the Vedas, which were the sacred traditions of India. They wanted off. They didn't want to come back. Life was terrible. That's what people don't have the adequate understanding of history, that for the majority of people, life is really hard, right? And you and I and your audience, among the lucky.
Yeah.
That we actually like life. We want to live.
Most of the time.
Yeah.
And a personal question. You have investigated some of the most powerful organizations and people in the world of cyber warfare, cybersecurity. Are you ever afraid for your own life, your own well-being, digital or physical?
I mean, I've had my moments. I've had our security team at the Times called me at one point and said someone's on the dark web offering good money to anyone who can hack your phone or your laptop. I describe in my book how when I was at that hacking conference in Argentina, I came back and I brought a burner laptop with me, but I'd kept it in the safe anyway, and it didn't have anything on it, but someone had broken in and it was moved. I've had all sorts of sort of scary moments. And then I've had moments where I think I went just way too far into the paranoid side. I mean, I remember writing about the Times hack by China, and I just covered a number of Chinese cyber attacks where they'd gotten into the thermostat at someone's corporate apartment, and they'd gotten into all sorts of stuff. And I was living by myself. I was single in San Francisco, and my cable box on my television started making some weird noises in the middle of the night. And I got up and I ripped it out of the wall. And I think I said something like embarrassing, like, fuck you, China, And then I went back to bed and I woke up and this beautiful morning light. I mean, I'll never forget it. This is glimmering morning light is shining on my cable box, which has now been ripped out and is sitting on my floor in the morning light. And I was just like, no. I'm not going down that road. You basically, I came to a road, a fork in the road where I could either go full tinfoil hat, go live off the grid, never have a car with navigation, never use Google Maps, never own an iPhone, never order diapers off Amazon, create an alias, or I could just do the best I can and live in this new digital world we're living in. And what does that look like for me? I mean, what are my crown jewels? This is what I tell people. What are your crown jewels? Because just focus on that. You can't protect everything, but you can protect your crown jewels. For me, for the longest time, my crown jewels were my sources. I was nothing without my sources. So I had some sources I would meet the same dim sum place, or maybe it was a different restaurant, on the same date, every quarter. And we would never drive there. We would never Uber there. We wouldn't bring any devices. I could bring a pencil and a notepad. And if someone wasn't in town, like there were a couple times where I'd show up and the source never came, but we never communicated digitally. And those were the lengths I was willing to go to protect that source. But you can't do it for everyone. So for everyone else, it was Signal, using two-factor authentication, keeping my devices up to date, not clicking on phishing emails, using a password manager, all the things that, we know we're supposed to do. And that's what I tell everyone. Like, don't go crazy, because then that's like the ultimate hack. Then they've hacked your mind, whoever they is for you. But just do the best you can. Now, my whole risk model changed when I had a kid. Now it's, oh God, if anyone threatened my family, God help them. But it's it changes you. And unfortunately, there are some things like I was really scared to go deep on, like Russian cybercrime, like Putin himself, and it's interesting. Like, I have a mentor who's an incredible person who was the Times Moscow bureau chief during the Cold War. And after I wrote a series of stories about Chinese cyber espionage, he took me out to lunch. And he told me that when he was living in Moscow, he would drop his kids off at preschool when they were my son's age now. And the KGB would follow him. And they would make a really loud show of it. They'd tail him, they'd, honk, they'd just be a ruckus, make a ruckus. And he said, you know what? They never actually did anything, but they wanted me to know that they were following me. And I operated accordingly. And he says, that's how you should operate in the digital world. Know that there are probably people following you. Sometimes they'll make a little bit of noise. But one thing you need to know is that while you're at the New York Times, you have a little bit of an invisible shield on you. If something were to happen to you, that would be a really big deal. That would be an international incident. So I kind of carried that invisible shield with me for years. And then Jamal Khashoggi happened. And that destroyed my vision of my invisible shield. Sure, he was a Saudi, but he was a Washington Post columnist. For the most part, he was living in the United States. He was a journalist. And for them to do what they did to him pretty much in the open and get away with it, and for the United States to let them get away with it because we wanted to preserve diplomatic relations with the Saudis, that really threw my worldview upside down. And, I think that sent a message to a lot of countries that it was sort of open season on journalists. And to me, that was one of the most destructive things that happened under the previous administration. And, I don't really know what to think of my invisible shield anymore.
Like you said, that really worries me on the journalism side, that people would be afraid to dig deep on fascinating topics. And, I have my own, that's part of the reason I would love to have kids. I would love to have a family. Part of the reason I'm a little bit afraid, there's many ways to phrase this, but the loss of freedom in the way of doing all the crazy shit that I naturally do, which I would say the ethic of journalism is kind of not, is doing crazy shit without really thinking about it, is letting your curiosity really allow you to be free and explore. Whether it's stupidity or fearlessness, whatever it is, that's what great journalism is. And
all the concerns about security risks, do you think about your own mortality? Are you afraid of death?
I'm not afraid. I'm not looking forward to it. I don't want to rush it because I feel like I got some things I can still do here. But as a person of faith, I don't think I'm afraid. I'm 71. I know I don't have an infinite amount of time left. And I want to use the time I've got in some sort of way that matters. I'm not ready to become a full-time golfer. But I don't quite know what that is. I do feel that I've had a chance to do amazingly powerful things as far as experiences. And maybe God has something else in mind. I wrote this book 16 years ago, The Language of God, about science and faith, trying to explain how, from my perspective, these are compatible. These are in harmony. They're complementary if you are careful about which kind of question you're asking. And to my surprise, a lot of people seem to be interested in that. They were tired of hearing the extreme voices, like Dawkins at one end, and people like Ken Ham and Answers in Genesis on the other end, saying, if you trust science, you're going to hell. And they thought there must be a way that these things could get along. And that's what I tried to put forward. And then I started a foundation, BioLogos, which then I had to step away from to become NIH director, which has just flourished. Maybe because I stepped away, I don't know. But it now has millions of people who come to that website, and they run amazing meetings. And I think a lot of people have really come to a sense that this is okay. I can love science and I can love God, and that's not a bad thing. So maybe there's something more I can do in that space. Maybe that book is ready for a second edition.
I think so. But when you look back, life is finite. What do you hope your legacy is?
I don't know. This whole legacy thing seems a little bit hard to embrace. It feels a little self-promoting, doesn't it? I sort of feel like in many ways I went to my own funeral on October 5th when I announced that I was stepping down, and I got the most amazing responses from people, some of whom I knew really well, some of whom I didn't know at all, who were just telling me stories about something that I had contributed to that made a difference to them. And that was incredibly heartwarming. And that's enough. You know, I don't want to build an edifice. I don't have a plan for a monument or a statue, God help us. I do feel like I've been incredibly fortunate. I've had the chance to play a role in things that were pretty profound, from the Genome Project to NIH to COVID vaccines. And I ought to be plenty satisfied that I've had enough experiences here to feel pretty good about the way in which my life panned out.
So, I mean, one thing I want to ask, just on fear, because it's so fascinating, is have you learned anything about what it takes to overcome fears?
Yes, and that comes from a research study standpoint, two parallel tracks of research. One was done actually in mice, because we have a mouse lab also where we can probe around in different brain areas and try and figure out what interesting brain areas we might want to probe around in humans. And a graduate student in my lab, she's now at Caltech, Lindsay Soleil, published a paper back in 2018 showing that what at first might seem a little bit obvious, but the mechanisms are not, which is that there are really three responses to fear. You can pause, you can freeze essentially. You can retreat, you can back up, or you can go forward. And there's a single hub of neurons in the midbrain. It's actually not the midbrain, but it's in the middle of the thalamus, which is a forebrain structure. And depending on which neurons are active there's a much higher probability that a mouse, or it turns out, or a human will advance in the face of fear, or will pause, or will retreat. Now, that just assigns a neural structure to a behavioral phenomenon. But what's interesting is that it turns out that the lowest level of stress or autonomic arousal is actually associated with the pausing and freezing response. Mm-hmm. Then as the threat becomes more impending, and we used visual looms in this case, the retreat response has a slightly higher level of autonomic arousal and stress. So think about playing hide and go seek, and you're trying to stay quiet in a closet that you're hiding. If you're very calm, it's easy to stay quiet and still. As your level of stress goes up, it's harder to maintain that level of
quiet and stillness. You see this also in animals that are stalking. A cat will chatter its teeth. That's actually sort of top-down inhibition and trying to restrain behavior. So the freeze response is actually an active response, but it's fairly low stress. And what was interesting to us is that the highest level of autonomic arousal was associated with the forward movement toward the threat. So in your case, jumping out of the plane. However, the forward movement in the face of threat was linked to the activation of what we call collateral, which means just a side connection, literally a wire in the brain that connects to the dopamine circuits for reward. And so when one safely and adaptively, meaning you survive, moves through a threat or toward a threat, it's rewarded as a positive experience. And so the key, it actually maps very well to cognitive behavioral therapy and a lot of the existing treatments for trauma, is that you have to confront the thing that makes you afraid. So otherwise you exist in this very low level of reverberatory circuit activity where the circuits for autonomic arousal are humming, and they're humming more and more and more. And we have to remember that stress and fear and threat were designed to agitate us so that we actually move. So the reason I mention this is I think a lot of times people think that the maximum, stress response or fear response is to freeze and to lock up.
Yeah.
But that's actually not the maximum stress response. The maximum stress response is to advance, but it's associated with reward. It has positive valence.
Interesting. Yeah.
So there's this kind of, everyone always thinks about the bell shape, the sort of hump shape curve for, at low levels of arousal, performance is low. And as it increases, performance goes higher, and then it drops off as you get really stressed. But there's another bump further out the distribution where you perform very well under very high levels of stress. And so we've been spending a lot of time in humans and in animals exploring what it takes to get people comfortable to go to that place, and also to let them experience how there are heightened states of cognition there. There's changes in time perception that allow you to evaluate your environment at a faster frame rate, essentially. This is the matrix, as a lot of people think of it.
Yeah.
But we tend to think about fear as all the low level stuff where things aren't worked out. But there are a lot of different features to the fear response. And so we think about it quantitatively, and we think about it from a circuit perspective in terms of outcomes, and we try and weigh that against the threat. So we never want people to put themselves in unnecessary risk, but that's where the VR is fun, because you can push people hard without risk of physically injuring them.
And that's, like you said, the little bump, that seems to be a very small fraction of the human experience, right? So it's kind of fascinating to study it, because most of us move through life without ever experiencing that kind of focus. You've mentioned that in your lab at Stanford, you induce stress by putting people into virtual reality and having them go through one of a set of experiences. I think you mentioned this on Rogan or with Whitney, that scare them. So just on a practical, psychological level, and maybe on a philosophical level, what are people afraid of? What are the fears? What are these fear experiences that you find to be effective?
Yeah, so it depends on the person, obviously. And we should probably define fear, right? Because you can, without going too far down the rabbit hole of defining these things, you can't really have fear without stress, but you could have stress without fear. And you can't really have trauma without fear and stress, but you could have fear and stress without trauma. So, we can start playing the word game. And that actually is one of the motivations for even having a laboratory that studies these things, is that we really need better physiological, neuroscientific, and operational definitions of what these things are. I mean, the field of understanding emotions and states, which is mainly what I'm interested in, is very complicated. But we can do away with a lot of complicated debate and say, in our laboratory, what we're looking for to assign it a value of fear is a big inflection in autonomic arousal, so increases in heart rate, increases in breathing, perspiration, pupil dilation, all the hallmark signature features of the stress response. And in some cases, we have the benefit of getting neurosurgery patients where we've got electrodes in their amygdala and their insula and the orbital frontal cortex down beneath the skull. So these are chronically implanted electrodes. We're getting multi-unit signals, and we can start seeing some central features of meaning within the brain. And what's interesting is that, as trivial as it might seem in listening to it, almost everybody responds to heights and falling from a high virtual place with a very strong stress, if not fear response. And that's because the visual vestibular apparatus, right, the optic flow and how it links to the, balanced semicircular canals of the inner ears, all this technical stuff. But really, all of that pulls all your physiology, the feeling that your stomach is dropping, the feeling that you're sweating, even though you're not afraid of falling off this virtual platform, but you feel as if you're falling, because of the optic flow. That one is universal. So we've got a dive with great white sharks experience where you actually exit the cage. We went out and did this in the real world and brought back 360 video that's built out pretty.
Oh, so this is actual 360 video.
360 video. Awesome. And this was important to us, right? So when we decided to set up this platform, a lot of the motivation was that a lot of the studies of these things in laboratories, I don't want to call them lame because I want to be respectful of the people that did this stuff before, but they'd study fear by, showing subjects a picture of a bloody arm, right, or a snake or something like that. And it just, unless you have a snake phobia, it just wasn't creating a real enough experience. So we need to do something where people aren't going to get injured, but where we can tap into the physiology and that thing of presence of people momentarily, not the whole time, but momentarily forgetting they're in a laboratory. Mm-hmm. And so heights will always do it. And if people want to challenge me on this, I like to point to that movie Free Solo, which was wild because, it's an incredible movie, but I think a lot of its popularity can be explained by a puzzle, which is you knew he was going to live when you walked in the theater. Right. Or you watched it at home. You knew before that he survived, and yet it was still scary that people somehow were able to put themselves into that experience or into Alex's experience enough that they were concerned or worried or afraid at some level. So heights always does it. If we get people who have generalized anxiety, these are people who wake up and move through life at a generally higher state of autonomic arousal and anxiety, then we can tip them a little bit more easily with things that don't necessarily get everyone afraid. Things like claustrophobia, public speaking. That's going to vary from person to person. And then if you're afraid of sharks, like my sister, for instance, is afraid of sharks, she won't even come to my laboratory because there's a thing about sharks in it. That's how terrified some people are of these specific stimuli. But heights gets them every time.
Yeah.
And
I'm terrified of heights.
It's when we have you step off a platform, virtual platform, and it's a flat floor in my lab. But you're up there.
Well, you actually allow them the possibility in the virtual world to actually take the leap of faith.
Yeah, maybe I should describe a little bit of the experiment. So, without giving away too much in case someone wants to be a subject in one of these experiments, we have them playing a cognitive game. It's a simple lights out kind of game where you're pointing a cursor and turning out lights on a grid, but it gets increasingly complex and it speeds up on them. And, there's a failure point for everybody where they just can't make the motor commands fast enough. And then we surprise people essentially by placing them virtually. All of a sudden they're on a narrow platform between two buildings. Yeah. And then we encourage them, or we cue them by talking to them through a microphone to continue across that platform to continue the game. And some people they just won't. They actually will get down on the ground and hold on to a virtual beam that doesn't even exist on a flat floor. And so what this really tells us is the power of the brain to enter these virtual states as if they were real. And we really think that anchoring the visual and the vestibular, the balance components of the nervous system, are what bring people into that presence so quickly. There's also the potential, and we haven't done this yet, to bring in 360 sound. So the reason we did 360 video is that when we started all this back in 2016, a lot of the VR was pretty lame, frankly. It was CGI. It just wasn't real enough. But with 360 video, we knew that we could get people into this presence where they think they're in a real experience more quickly. And our friend Michael Muller, who I was introduced to because of the project, I reached out to some friends. Michael Muller is a very famous portrait photographer in Hollywood, but he dives with great white sharks and he leaves the cage. And so we worked with him to build a 360 video apparatus that we could swim under water with, went out to Guadalupe Island, Mexico, and actually got the experience. It was a lot of fun. It was there were some interesting moments out there of danger, but it came back with that video and built that for the sharks. And then we realized we need to do this for everything. We need to do it for heights. We need to do it for public speaking, for claustrophobia. And what's missing still is 360 sound, where 360 sound would be, for instance, if I were to turn around and there was a giant attack dog there, the moment I would turn around and see it, the dog would growl. But if I turned back toward you, then it would be silent. So, and that brings a very real element to one's own behavior, where you don't know what's going to happen if you turn a corner. Whereas if there's a dog growling behind me and I turn around and then I turn back to you and it's still growling, that might seem like more of an impending threat, but and sustained threat, but actually it's when you start linking your own body movements to the experience. So when it's closed loop, where my movements and choices are starting to influence things and they're getting scarier and scarier, that's when you can really drive people's nervous system down these paths of high states of stress and fear. Now, we don't want to traumatize people, obviously, but we also study a number of tools that allow them to calm themselves in these environments. So the short answer is heights.
Heights.
Yeah.
There's something about embarrassment I've competed a lot in my life, and I think if I'm too introspective, the thing I'm most afraid of is being like humiliated, I think.
Well, yeah, nobody cares about that. Look, you're the only person on the planet that cares about you being humiliated.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like a really useless thought.
It is.
It's like you're all humiliated. Something happened in a room full of people and they walk out and they didn't think about it one more second. Or maybe somebody told a funny story to somebody else.
And then it dissipates it throughout. Yeah. Yeah.
No, I know it too. I mean, I've been really embarrassed about shit that nobody cared about myself.
Yeah.
It's a funny thing.
So the worst thing ultimately is just,
but that's a cage and then you have to get out of it.
Yeah.
Like here's the thing, once you find something like that, you have to be determined to break it. Because otherwise you'll just, so you accumulate that kind of junk and then you die as a mess.
So the goal, I guess it's like a cage within a cage. I guess the goal is to die in the biggest possible cage.
Well, ideally you'd have no cage.
Wow.
People do get enlightened. I've met a few. It's great.
You found a few? There's a few out there? I don't know.
Of course there are. Either that or they have, it's a great sales pitch. There's like enlightened people write books and doing all kinds of stuff.
It's a good way to sell a book. I'll give you that.
You've never met somebody you just thought, they just kill me. Like they just, like mental clarity, humor.
No, 100%, but I just feel like they're living in a bigger cage. They have their own.
You still think there's a cage.
There's still a cage.
You secretly suspect there's always a cage.
There's nothing outside the universe.
There's nothing outside the cage.
You worked at a bunch of companies. You led a lot of amazing teams. I'm not sure if you've ever been like in the early stages of a startup, but do you have advice for somebody that wants to do a startup or build a company, like build a strong team of engineers that are passionate, just want to solve a big problem? Like, is there more specifically on that point?
Well, you have to be really good at stuff. If you're going to lead and build a team, you better be really interested in how people work and think.
People or the solution to the problem. So there's two things, right? One is how people work, and the other is the
Well, actually, there's quite a few successful startups. It's pretty clear the founders don't know anything about people. Like the idea was so powerful that it propelled them. But I suspect somewhere early they hired some people who understood people, because people really need a lot of care and feeding to collaborate and work together and feel engaged and work hard. Like startups are all about outproducing other people. Like you're nimble because you don't have any legacy. You don't have, a bunch of people who are depressed about life, just showing up. So startups have a lot of advantages that way.
Do you like the Steve Jobs talked about this idea of A players and B players? I don't know if you know this formulation.
No. That organizations that get taken over by B player leaders often really underperform. They hire C players. That said, in big organizations, there's so much work to do. Like, and there's so many people who are happy to do what, like the leadership or the big idea people would consider menial jobs.
Mm-hmm.
And, you need a place for them, but you need an organization that both values and rewards them, but doesn't let them take over the leadership of it.
Got it. But so you need to have an organization that's resistant to that. But in the early days, the notion with Steve was that like one B player in a room of A players will be like destructive to the whole.
I've seen that happen. I don't know if it's like always true. Like, you run into people who are clearly B players, but they think they're A players. And so they have a loud voice at the table and they make lots of demands for that. But there's other people who are like, I know who I am. I just want to work with, cool people on cool shit and just tell me what to do and I'll go get it done.
Yeah.
So you have to, again, this is like people skills. Like, what kind of person is it? I've met some really great people I love working with that weren't the biggest ID people, they're most productive ever, but they show up, they get it done. They create connection and community that people value. It's pretty diverse. I don't think there's a recipe for that.
Are you afraid of death?
I mean, it's easy for me to say no as I sit here, probably not about to die, but...
Is this like the UFC question? Can you defeat any opponent?
Exactly.
The answer is yes.
The answer is, of course, yes. And I don't have... They're not around. They're not here, are they? Yeah, exactly. But
I mean, do you ponder your own mortality? Maybe another context to that is you mentioned 2 deaths for martial artists.
I think that's actually why, honestly, even though at a relatively young age, I think mortality is something that I'm aware of, maybe more than the average person. I think probably most athletes can speak to this, and anyone that's had trouble. I've managed to slide out of a couple near-death experiences personally, mostly river-related, because I'm an idiot. But I regret nothing. But thank God we're here. But it is an interesting seeing the end and seeing going, well, what's going to happen. I guess I think it comes back to kind of what we're discussing about belief structure and belief system. I think a lot of times if I recognize that no matter what I do, it's all going to end one day. And then you go, well, why were we here? What would I do? Am I going to make it to 40? I have no idea. I'd like to hope so. I had no idea that I was going to make it to the age that I am now. Am I going to make it to 80? How much of that is in my control? Much of it is not. I mean, it's so funny. It's an interesting, like back to the belief structure again, like locus of internal and external locus of control. What's facilitative versus what's true. And, I think accepting personal responsibility for more than is on my control is probably a positive. But at the same time, recognizing that much is not in my control. I was fortunate enough to be born in the United States, fortunate enough to not, knock on wood, have a serious disease that I'm not aware of right now. I didn't do any of that. I just showed up. That was really fortunate. And I guess that doesn't diminish the fact that I've tried to make decent choices, but it works in concert with it. And I guess when you go, is death what I want right now? No, I should think not. And again, it's easier for me to be relatively calm about it as I'm not staring it in the face. But what I would care a lot more about is how you live. That's what's in my control. And I can't control if as I walk out of this building, a helicopter falls on me. Worrying about that, I can't control. Maybe I have cancer now and I don't know it. And I really hope not. But
there's something about meditating on the fact that it could end today, outside your control, that can clarify your thinking about the fact that life is amazing. Like just kind of helping you enjoy this moment.
Even if life was horrible, let's say, for instance, it was you live at one of those times or places, and those places still exist in this world today, that life is brutal and metal and whatever all and short and painful. Would you still want it? And again, as I'm sitting here, not on fire physically, it's easy to say yes, but I'm confident I'll plant my feet and say yes. Any life is amazing and beautiful and a gift, an unbelievable gift that none of us have earned. For the record, I hate the word earned. A lot of times, you earn, but it's like there's a lot of good fortune in earning, and that's back to: do I want justice or do I want grace? And I guess we're all fortunate to be where we are, no matter where we are, and hopefully it should give us some sense of perspective, some sense of compassion for other people, but also, like you said, a sense of peace. Where if it all ended right now, would I be happy with with a life to this point? I'm like, of course. Would you like to live a little longer? Yeah, I would try to do more and try to live rightly to the best that I know how, which over time will hopefully continue to evolve in a positive direction. But if the answer to that is no, I guess that's always that's a sign that what I'm doing is not what I'm meant to be doing. And I mean, you're familiar with Tecumseh before? So I've got one actually. If you could give me 10 seconds, I'll read this one out. This is a personal favorite. Basically, and I think it sums up, I mean, again, it's one of those quotes on the internet, like when Abraham Lincoln said, don't believe everything you read online. But this is, it's, again, attributed, but it's like, so live your life that the fear of death can never enter your heart. Trouble no one about their religion, respect others in their view, and demand that they respect yours. Love your life, perfect your life, beautify all things in your life. Seek to make your life long and its purpose in the service of your people. Prepare a noble death song for the day when you go over the great divide. Always give a word or sign, a salute when meeting or passing a friend, even a stranger when in a lonely place. Show respect to all people and grovel to none. When you arise in the morning, give thanks for the food and for the joy of living. If you see no reason for giving thanks, the fault lies only in yourself. Abuse no one and no thing, for abuse turns the wise ones to fools and robs the spirit of its vision. When it comes your time to die, be not like those whose hearts are filled with the fear of death, so that when their time comes, they weep and pray for a little more time to live their lives over again in a different way. Sing your death song and die like a hero going home.
Powerful words. I don't think there's a better way to end it. Let me just say, we've spoke maybe 5-6 years ago. I don't even remember when, but I'm not exaggerating saying like you had a huge impact on my life because of the podcast. You're the reason I was doing the podcast as long as I have. You're the reason I'm doing this podcast. And it's a stupid little meeting that you probably didn't know who I was. I didn't really know who you are. It was just like a magical moment. It's a flap of a butterfly wing kind of situation. And yeah, I'm forever grateful. You're one of the most inspiring people in my life. So Ryan, it's a huge honor that you would come here, Jen, and talk with me and waste all this time. I really appreciate it. It was amazing.
Thank you so much, Lex. It's just been a pleasure. Really appreciate you having us on. Thank you.
Thanks, brother. Thanks for listening to this conversation with Ryan Hall, and thank you to our sponsors, PowerDot, Babbel, and Cash App. Please check out these sponsors in the description to get a discount and to support this podcast. If you enjoy this thing, subscribe on YouTube, review it with 5 stars on Apple Podcasts, follow on Spotify, support on Patreon, or connect with me on Twitter at Lex Fridman. And now, let me leave you with some words from Frank Herbert in Dune. Deep in the human unconscious is a pervasive need for a logical universe that makes sense. But the real universe is always one step beyond logic. Thank you for listening and hope to see you next time. Have you ever been afraid on the mat? Does fear have any role, do you think, for a wrestler? Or it must be absent?
Well, I'm sure fear is out there. And I'm sure that was to my advantage almost every time. I'm sure in my Olympic finals, Azruliev, he had these doubts. He probably had these doubts. And that gives me the edge. And I don't know if I really ever had fear. But obviously there was points and times where I didn't perform as well. Not many, but a few. And if I look back at it, I don't think it was that American, raw stuff. I think it was probably the fear of not being an artist as much. Maybe this guy might be better than me scientifically. And, you're a scientist. I think that got to me more than anything else. I said early on that I want to eliminate ever having to worry about getting tired in a match. Mm-hmm. So I kind of eliminated that. So I got rid of that point. And I do think that in wrestling, that is one of the fears that a lot of wrestlers have. Actually, how they feel during the match. And are they going to get tired? And is it going to affect my performance? And as a coach, that really was one of the things I tried to eliminate on all my athletes. So there wasn't that fear factor. But that fear factor would be put upon my opponent, mm-hmm. which would give me
an edge. But that's not what I needed as much. I needed to just focus, make sure that I was doing the right things. And I needed my team to be focused. So I made sure that for my mistakes as an athlete or even as a coach sometimes, that I didn't repeat them. And if you make a mistake once and then you can repeat it, then it's like you didn't learn anything.
Your goal throughout your wrestling career, as you've beautifully put, was to work so hard that you pass out on the mat, right? That you would be carried off the mat. So you never did successfully that's one of the ways you failed in your careers. You've never worked so hard that you've passed out. Have you ever come close? Do you remember a time that you've come close, that you've been pushed to the limits of exhaustion?
You know, the question is really a good question about that pushing to you collapse.
Yeah.
Because as a coach today, I don't think I could, if I said that to my athletes, I don't know, I could get in trouble. Because, it's like
understood, isn't it? By the athletes?
Yeah, they understand it, but the outside might not understand it because it's almost like, what do you mean? You push them to the point where they go collapse. That means they may die or something might happen to them. And that's dangerous. That's dangerous. We can't have our kid in that type of atmosphere, but it's something that's highly unlikely that's going to happen. But I'm going to tell you, there's many times in a practice where I had pushed myself to all of a sudden the whistle blew or it was time to stop. And when I got up off the mat or wherever I was at and I needed water, I needed fresh air because you're usually in a fairly small room with a lot of guys that the heat rises and it's hard to breathe. And that I can remember, and I stayed a lot of times not by the door, at the far end of the room. I can remember walking from the far end of the room to that door. And I can remember, am I going to make it the next step? Am I going to make it the next step?
Yeah.
I need air. I need water. I need oxygen. I need to get out of here. It didn't happen often, but I can recount 4 or 5 times in my career that I pushed myself to that level where I thought I was going to maybe go out, but every step I was dizzy. But once I got to that door, I was able to open it and go out and grab the water and get cold water in my face. And so, no, I never really was able to do that. And I think the story is in a book where my daughter pushed to collapse, Molly.
I made you proud.
Oh, my gosh. And she didn't win.
Yeah.
But she pushed to collapse.
Yeah.
Now, did she suffer because of that? Well, she didn't get to go to the next event because she had to qualify, but I think it probably helped her too, realizing because she was winning the race and she was beating people she normally never pushed, but she was at a new level that she had never been before, and she only needed about 5 feet to finish. And it was just one of those things that I bet there was a lot of learning that she did there, and it probably made her realize that she could be better, but she had to hold up though.
Could have done it.
The most unpleasant thing about COVID is the uncertainty, and that's what leads to fear on both the vaccine hesitant. It's the uncertainty about the vaccine, and people who have taken the vaccine. The uncertainty around, like, am I in danger walking around? Can I walk down the hall? Like this fear of the world around you, and I think testing allows you to remove a lot of that uncertainty. Like you gain back confidence that you can operate in this world and not get infected. And you become like a nicer person. Mm-hmm. I find myself every time I get tested, I become a nicer person to others because I know I'm not
putting them in danger.
I'm not putting people in danger.
It's a heavy burden to carry, to worry. Am I infectious? Like, I was out last night, but I do want to go see my mom today, Like, am I infectious? I don't know. And this has created massive anxiety. And I completely agree that it's a relieving feeling. And it's an amazing feeling to be in a room and I did this in the middle of the pandemic when everyone was supposed to be wearing a mask indoors. I had everyone rapid test, and I said, everyone should rapid test before you walk into this room. Mm-hmm. And it was a wonderful experiment because everyone was just so relaxed.
Yeah.
The alternative is nobody tests and everyone wears a mask. You have a mask that maybe gives you 20% maybe protection, if you're all in the same room together, if that. Or you have a rapid test program where everyone rapid tests before, and that gives you like 95% to 100% protection, not 100%, but close. And all of a sudden that allows everyone to take a big sigh and be like, wow, this is the first time I've seen people without masks indoors in a long time, and I feel pretty good. And restaurants are scary right now because you just don't know who might be infectious and nobody's masked. And like, wouldn't it be great to just go into a restaurant where you know that everyone just tested negative that day? It just really reduces anxiety. It makes individuals feel empowered. And I mean, at the end of the day, COVID and our response to COVID it's truly an information problem. Mm-hmm. You know, why do we quarantine anyone? Why did we ever close anything down? We didn't close things down because everyone is positive. We closed things down because we didn't know if anyone was positive. We quarantine a whole classroom of kids, not because they're all positive, but because we don't know if one of them are positive. And so we just quarantine everyone. When there's a positive in the case, in the classroom, like one day, we'll then ask the whole classroom not to come to school for 10 days. That's not a biological problem. That's an information problem. And the crazy thing is we have the tool to solve that information problem. It's literally our eyes on the virus. It's how we see this virus. And if everyone glowed green when they were infectious, we would have never had to close down any society, and we would have never had the outbreaks because we would have been able to stay away from the green people. You know, and
yeah, I like what you say. The quarantine is an information problem. That's absolutely right. Is there something you can say to what people can do, like listening to this, individuals? Do you just complain like loudly, like why can't we do this? Can you speak with your money somehow? What can people do to help?
God, it's amazing to think you're asking me this question, and this video will go out to the web and all the people that watch you. And last year in July, maybe something like that, June, I forget exactly when it was, I was on TWIV, This Week in Virology.
Shout out to TWIV. Those guys are awesome.
They are awesome. I love TWIV. And they asked me the exact same question towards the end. They said, this makes so much sense. Why wouldn't we do this? What can people do? And so I said, oh, just send me an email, like write to me. I'm sure you could find my email somewhere online, mm-hmm. and get in touch, and I will, and we can try to figure out how to make something happen.
Yeah, that was
bad
smart.
Idea.
Very smart.
Way too many emails. I feel bad because I didn't end up getting back to anyone because I just got inundated. But it did lead to the development of rapidtest.org, where we did automate the process of writing letters to congressional members and elected representatives. So that helps. Fast forward to today. What can people do? I honestly don't know. Like, what can the average person at this point do? We have tried everything. The FDA is immutable on this. They will not change, and we shouldn't ask them to change because they have decided that this is how they regulate medical devices, and they're going to stick to it. So what we need to do, and maybe this is something to do, is if you know people who have sway over politicians, lobbyists, whatever it might be, let people know to request that the president, literally the president of the United States, uses executive powers to just do something as simple as designating these powerful public health tools as public health tools. Allow the CDC and the NIH or whomever it must be, or academic centers of excellence designated by the CDC, to evaluate the tests in a very fast fashion with the appropriate metrics that these tests need to achieve for public health. And within 2 days, we can have 10 new tests authorized. Mm-hmm. This doesn't have to be a 6 to 12 month endeavor. This could be a 2-day endeavor. We actually did it. I judged the Rapid Test X Prize. Mm-hmm. And it went great. We actually got incredible metrics about how well does each test work. And no clinical trials, just a couple days worth of work in the lab, and boom. And if we actually systematized it, it would be an hour or so in the lab. So simple. So I don't know. I don't know how to really impact change. Thankfully, I have a platform, and I've been able to start talking with people who are very close to the president and the White House. And And I do think that some change is finally happening because the silver bullet of the vaccine has not panned out to be the silver bullet. So now now I think we're moving from a country that was a vaccine only approach to finally recognizing at the highest levels that there's other tools.
Are people freaked out by the fact that there's a robot? So it's not just the appearance, but there's an artificial human.
Anything people, I think, and I'm just also fascinated by the blind spots humans have. So the idea that you're afraid of that, I mean, how many robots have killed people? How many humans have died at the hands of other humans?
Yeah.
Millions?
A few more. Yeah.
Hundreds of millions?
Yeah.
Yet we're scared of that? Yeah. And we'll go to the grocery store and be around a bunch of humans who statistically the chances are much higher that you're going to get killed by a human. So I'm just fascinated by, without judgment, how irrational we are as a species.
The worry is the exponential. So it's, you can say the same thing about nuclear weapons before we dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So the worry that people have is the exponential growth. So, so it's like, oh, it's fun and games right now, but, overnight, especially if a robot provides value to society, we'll put one in every home and then all of a sudden lose track of the actual large scale impact it has on society. And then all of a sudden we'll gain greater and greater control to where we'll all be, affect our political system and then affect our decisions.
Didn't robots already ruin our political system? Didn't that just already happen?
Which ones? Oh, Russia hacking.
No offense. But hasn't that already happened? I mean, that was like an algorithm of negative things being clicked on more.
We'd like to tell stories and we'd like to demonize certain people. I think nobody understands our current political system or discourse on Twitter, the Twitter mobs. Nobody has a sense, not Twitter, not Facebook, the people running it. Nobody understands the impact of these algorithms. They're trying their best. Yeah. Despite what people think, they're not like a bunch of lefties trying to make sure that Hillary Clinton gets elected. It's more that it's an incredibly complex system that we don't, and that's the worry. It's so complex and moves so fast that nobody will be able to stop it once it happens.
And let me ask a question. This is a very savage question.
Yeah.
Which is this just the next stage of evolution as humans? Some people will die. Yes. I mean, that's always happened, This is just taking emotion out of it? Is this basically the next stage of survival of the fittest?
Yeah. You have to think of organisms. What is it mean to be a living organism? Like, is a smartphone part of your living organism, or
we're in relationships with our phones?
Yeah,
but we have sex through them, with them. What's the difference between with them and through them?
But it also expands your cognitive abilities, expands your memory, knowledge, and so on. So you're a much smarter person because you have a smartphone in your hand.
But as soon as it's out of my hand, we've got big problems because we become sort of so morphed with them.
Well, there's a symbiotic relationship, and that's what so Elon Musk, the Neuralink, is working on, trying to increase the bandwidth of communication between computers and your brain. And so further and further expand our ability as human beings to sort of leverage machines. And maybe that's the future, the next evolutionary step. It could be also that, yes, we'll give birth, just like we give birth to human children right now, we'll give birth to AI and they'll replace us. I think it's a really interesting possibility.
I'm going to play devil's advocate. I just think that the fear of robots is wildly classist because, Facebook, like it's easy for us to say they're taking their data. Okay, a lot of people that get employment off of Facebook, they are able to get income off of Facebook. They don't care if you take their phone numbers and their emails and their data as long as it's free. They don't want to have to pay $5 a month for Facebook. Facebook is a wildly democratic thing. Forget about the election and all that kind of stuff. A lot of, technology making people's lives easier. I find that most elite people are more scared than lower income people. So, and women for the most part. So the idea of something that's stronger than us and that might eventually kill us, like women are used to that. Like that's not, I see a lot of like really rich men being like, the robots are going to kill us. We're like, what's another thing that's going to kill us? I tend to see like, oh, something can walk me to my car at night. Like something can help me cook dinner, something, for people in underprivileged countries who can't afford eye surgery, like can we send a robot to underprivileged places to do surgery where they can't. I work with this organization called Operation Smile, where they do cleft palate surgeries. And there's a lot of places that can't do a very simple surgery because they can't afford doctors and medical care and such. So I just see, and this can be completely naive and should be completely wrong, but I feel like a lot of people are going like, the robots are going to destroy us. Humans, we're destroying ourselves. We're self-destructing. Robots, to me, are the only hope to clean up all the messes that we've created. Even when we go try to clean up pollution in the ocean, we make it worse because of the oil that the tankers use. It's like, to me, robots are the only solution. Firefighters are heroes, but they're limited in how many times they can run into a fire. So there's just something interesting to me. I'm not hearing a lot of lower income, more vulnerable populations talking about robots.
Maybe you can speak to it a little bit more. There's an idea, I think you've expressed it. I've heard actually a few female writers and roboticists I've talked to express this idea that exactly what you just said, which is, it just seems that being afraid of existential threats of artificial intelligence is a male issue.
Yeah.
And I wonder what that is. If it because men haven't, in certain positions, like you said, it's also a classist issue. They haven't been humbled by life, and so you always look for the biggest problems to take on around you.
It's a champagne problem to be afraid of robots. Most people don't have health insurance. They're afraid they're not going to be able to feed their kids. They can't afford a tutor for their kids. I just think of, the way I grew up, and I had a mother who, worked 2 jobs, had kids. We couldn't afford an SAT tutor. The idea of a robot coming in, being able to tutor your kids, being able to provide childcare for your kids, being able to come in with cameras for eyes and make sure, surveillance. I'm very pro surveillance because, I've had security problems, and I've been, we're generally in a little more danger than you guys are. So I think that robots are a little less scary to us because we can see them maybe as free assistance, help, and protection. And then there's sort of another element for me personally, which is maybe more of a female problem. I don't know. I'm just going to make a generalization. Happy to be wrong. But, the emotional sort of component of robots and what they can provide in terms of, I think there's a lot of people that don't have microphones that I just recently kind of stumbled upon in doing all my research on the sex robots for my stand-up special, which is there's a lot of very shy people that aren't good at dating. There's a lot of people who are scared of human beings, who, have personality disorders or grew up in alcoholic homes or struggle with addiction or whatever it is, where a robot can solve an emotional problem. And so we're largely having this conversation about rich guys that are emotionally healthy and how scared of robots they are. We're forgetting about a huge part of the population who maybe isn't as charming and effervescent and solvent as, people like you and Elon Musk, who these robots could solve very real problems in their life, emotional or financial.
Well, that's in general, a really interesting idea that most people in the world don't have a voice. It's, you've talked about it, sort of even the people on Twitter who are driving the conversation. You said comments. People who leave comments represent a very tiny percent of the population. Mm-hmm. And they're the ones we tend to think they speak for the population, but it's very possible on many topics they don't at all.
And look, I'm sure there's got to be some kind of legal, sort of structure in place for when the robots happen. You know way more about this than I do, but for me to just go, the robots are bad, that's a wild generalization that I feel like is really inhumane in some way. Just after the research I've done, you're going to tell me that a man whose wife died suddenly and he feels guilty moving on with a human woman or can't get over the grief, he can't have a sex robot in his own house? Why not? Who cares? Why do you care?
Well, there's an interesting aspect of human nature. So, we tend to, as a civilization, to create a group that's the other in all kinds of ways.
Right.
And so you work with animals too. You're especially sensitive to the suffering of animals. Let me kind of ask, do you think we'll abuse robots in the future? Do you think some of the darker aspects of human nature will come out?
I think some people will, but if we design them properly, the people that do it, we can put it on a record and we can put them in jail. We can find sociopaths more easily. You know, like.
But why is that? Why is that a sociopathic thing to harm a robot?
I think, look, I don't know enough about the consciousness and stuff as you do. I guess it would have to be when they're conscious, but it is, you know, the part of the brain that is, you know, responsible for compassion, the frontal lobe or whatever. Like, people that abuse animals also abuse humans and commit other kinds of crimes. Like, it's all the same part of the brain. No one abuses animals and then is like awesome to women and children and awesome to underprivileged, you know, minorities. Like, it's all. So, you know, we've been working really hard to put a database together of all the people that have abused animals. So when they commit another crime, you go, okay, this is, you know, it's all the same stuff. And I think people probably think I'm nuts for a lot of the animal work I do, but because when animal abuse is present, another crime is always present, but the animal abuse is the most socially acceptable. You can kick a dog and there's nothing people can do, but then what they're doing behind closed doors, you can't see. So there's always something else going on, which is why I never feel compunction about it. But I do think we'll start seeing the same thing with robots. Yes. The person that kicks I felt compassion when the kicking the dog robot really pissed me off. I know that they're just trying to get the stability right and all that, but I do think there will come a time where that will be a great way to be able to figure out if somebody has like, you know, antisocial behavior.
Are you afraid of death? Let's start with an easy question.
There's no warm up. That's it. We're
no warm up.
No jumping jacks. Let's break that down into two questions. I'm a human being, and like any human being, I'm biologically programmed to be terrified of death. Every physical element in our bodies is designed to keep us away from death. I'm no different from anyone else in that regard. If you throw me from the top of the Empire State Building, I'm going to scream all the way down to the concrete. If you wave a loaded firearm in my face, I'm going to flinch away in horror the same way anyone else would. So in that first sense of, are you afraid of death? My body is terrified of injury leading to death the same way any other human being would.
So when death is imminent, there's a terror that
I go through the same adrenaline dumps that you would go through. Yeah. But on the other hand, you're also asking a much deeper question, which is presumably, are you afraid of non-existence? What comes after your physical death? And that's the more interesting question. No. I should start right by saying from the start, I'm a materialist. I don't believe that we have an immortal soul. I don't believe there's a life after our physical death. In this sense, from someone who starts from that point of view, you have to understand that everyone has two deaths. We always talk about our death as though there was only one, but we all have two deaths. There was a time before you were born when you were dead. You weren't afraid of that period of non-existence. You don't even think about it. So why would you be afraid of your second period of non-existence? You came from non-existence. You're going to go back into it. You weren't afraid of the first. Why are you somehow afraid of the second? So it doesn't really make sense to me as to why people would be afraid of non-existence. You dealt with it fine the first time. Deal with it the second time.
But your mind didn't exist for the first death.
And it won't exist after you die either.
But it does exist now enough to comprehend that there's this thing that you know nothing about that's coming, which is non-existent.
Actually, you do know about it because you know what it was like before you were born. It was just nothing. Like every time you go to sleep at night, you get a sneak preview of death. It's just this kind of nothing happens. You wake up in the morning, you're alive again.
But it's not about the sleeping. It's about the falling asleep. And every night when you fall asleep, you assume you're going to wake up. Here, you know you're not waking up. And the knowledge of that...
But there's a whole step from that to the idea of fearing it. I'm fully aware that there's going to be a time I don't wake up. But are you going to be afraid of it? Is there some mortal terror you have of this? No, you didn't have it before. You don't have it when you sleep. Going from the fact that you know you won't wake up to terror is two different things. That's an extra step. And at that point, you're making a choice at that point.
What about what some people in this context, we might call like the third death, which is when everybody forgets, the entirety of consciousness in the universe forgets that you've ever existed, that John Danaher ever existed. So
it's almost like a cosmic death. It's like everything goes. Yeah.
Not just, I would say it's like knowledge. The history books forget about who you are, because the history books.
This is inevitable, by the way. We're all very, very small players in a very big game, and inevitably we're all going to go at some point.
Yeah, but doesn't. So you're.
It's disappointing, of course. Like it's but it's not even. It would be arrogance to say I'm disappointed in the idea that I will disappear. But there's far greater things than me that will disappear. I mean, it's crushing to think that there's going to come a time when no one will ever hear Beethoven's symphonies again. That the mysteries of the pharaohs will be lost, and no one will even comprehend that they once existed. Like, humanity has come up with so many amazing things over its existence, and to think that one day this is just all happening on a tiny speck in a distant corner of a very small galaxy, and among millions of galaxies, that this is all for nothing. Okay, I can understand. There's a kind of dread that comes with this. But there's also a sense in which the moment you're born and the moment you can think about these things, you know this is your inevitable fate.
Is it so inevitable? So if we look at, we're in Austin, and there's a guy named Elon Musk, and he's hoping, in fact, that is the drive behind many of his passions, is the human beings becoming multiplanetary species and expanding out, exploring and colonizing the solar system, the galaxy, and maybe the rest of the universe. Is that something that fills you with excitement?
It's, as a project, it's very exciting. The whole, I mean, we all grew up with science fiction, the idea of exploration, the same way human beings in earlier centuries were thrilled at the idea of discovering a new world, you know, America or some other part of the world that they sail to and come back. But now, instead of sailing oceans, you're sailing solar systems, and ultimately even further. So of course that's exciting, but as far as relieving us from non-existence, it's just playing a delaying game, because ultimately even the universe itself, if the laws of thermodynamics are correct, will ultimately die.
Of course, we might not understand most of the physics and how the universe functions. You said laws of thermodynamics, but maybe that's just a tiny little fraction of what the universe actually is. Maybe there's multiple dimensions, maybe there's multiple universes, maybe the entirety of this experience. You know, there's guys like Donald Hoffman that think that all of this is just an illusion, that we don't, like, human cognition and perception constructs a whole, it's like a video game that we construct that's very distant from the actual reality, and maybe one day we'll understand that reality. Maybe it'll be like the Matrix kind of thing. So there's a lot of different possibilities here. And there's also a philosopher named Ernest Becker. I don't know if you know who that is. He wrote Denial of Death, and his idea, he disagrees with you, but he's dead now, is that he thinks that the terror of death, the terror of the knowledge that we're going to die, is within all of us, and is in fact the driver behind most of the creativity that we do, exploring out into the universe, but also you becoming one of the great scholars of the martial arts, the philosophers of fighting, is because you're actually terrified of death, and you want to somehow permeate, like, your knowledge, your ideas, your essence to permeate human civilization, so that even when your body dies, you live on.
I would agree with him insofar as death is the single greatest motivator for action. But going beyond that and saying that it's somehow terrifying, that's an extra step on his part. And not everyone's going to follow him on that step. I do believe that death is the single most important element in life that gives value to our days. If you think, for example, of a situation where a god came to you and gave you immortality, life would be very, very different for you. Your a talented research scientist, you work to a schedule. Why? Because ultimately, your life is finite, and actually very finite. And could be even more so if fate plays its hand and you die an early death or what have you. We never know what's going to happen tomorrow. As such, we get work done as soon as we can. The moment you gain immortality, you can always put every project off. You can always say, I don't need to do this today because I can do it 4 centuries from now. And as you extend artificially a human life, the motivation to get things done here and now and work industriously and excel fades away, because you can always come back to the idea that you can do this in the future. And so what gives value to our days is ultimately death. And value, it's not the only form of the reason behind value, but a huge part of what we consider value is scarcity. And death gives us scarcity of days and is probably the single greatest motivator for almost every action we partake in.
It's kind of tragic and beautiful that what makes things amazing is that they end.
Yeah, I think it would actually be a terrible burden to be immortal. You would, life would be in many ways very hollow and meaningless, I think. People talk about death taking away the meaning of life, but I think immortality would have a very similar effect in a different direction.
I mean, look, in our world, all we really have is credit.
I was always bothered by how much value credit is given.
That's the only thing you got. I mean, if you're an academic in some sense, well, it isn't the only thing you've got, but it feels that way sometimes.
But you got the actual, we're all going to be dead soon.
Mm-hmm.
You got the joy of having created.
Yeah.
The credit with Yann. I've talked to Jürgen Schmidhuber, right?
Mm-hmm.
The Turing Award given to 3 people for deep learning. And you could say that a lot of other people should be on that list. It's the Nobel Prize question. Yeah, it's sad. It's sad, and people like talking about it, but I feel like in the long arc of history, the only person who will be remembered is Einstein, Hitler, maybe Elon Musk.
Mm-hmm. Well,
and the rest of us are just like...
Well, someone asked me about immortality once, and I said, and I stole this from somebody else, I don't remember who, but it was, I asked them, what's your great-grandfather's name? Any of them. And of course, they don't know. Most of us do not know. I mean, I'm not entirely sure I know my grandparents' name, all my grandparents' names. I know what I called them, right? I don't know their middle names, for example. It's within living memory, so I could find out. Actually, my grandfather didn't know when he was born. I had no idea how old he was, right? But I definitely don't know who any of my great-grandparents are. So in some sense, immortality is doing something preferably positive so that your great-grandchildren know who you are, right? And that's kind of what you can hope for, which is very depressing in some ways. I could turn it into something uplifting if you need me to, but
yeah, can you do the work here?
Yeah, it's simple, right? It doesn't matter. I don't have to know who my great-grandfather was to know that I wouldn't be here without him.
Yeah.
And I don't know who my great-grandchildren are, certainly who my great-great-grandchildren are, and I'll probably never meet them, although I would very much like to. But hopefully I'll set the world in motion in such a way that their lives will be better than they would have been if I hadn't done that. Well, certainly they wouldn't have existed if I hadn't done the things that I did. So I think that's a good positive thing. You live on through other people.
Are you afraid of death?
I don't know if I'm afraid of death, but I don't like it.
That's another t-shirt. I mean, do you ponder it? Do you think about the
inevitability of oblivion?
Yes.
I do occasionally. This feels like a very Russian conversation, actually.
It's very, yeah.
I will tell you a story, something that happened to me recently. If you look very carefully, you will see I have a scar.
Yes.
Which, by the way, is an interesting story of its own about why people who have half of their thyroid taken out, some people get scars and some don't. But anyway, I had half my thyroid taken out. The way I got there, by the way, is its own interesting story, but I won't go into it. Just suffice it to say, I did what I keep telling people you should never do, which is never go to the doctor unless you have to, because there's nothing good that's ever going to come out of a doctor's visit, right? So I went to the doctor
to look at one thing, this little bump I had on the side that I thought might be something bad because my mother made me. And I went there and he's like, oh, it's nothing. But by the way, your thyroid is huge. Can you breathe? Yes, I can breathe. Are you sure? Because it's pushing on your windpipe. You should be dead. Right. So I ended up going there and to get my, to look at my thyroid. It was growing. I had what's called a goiter. And he said, we're going to have to take it out at some point. When? Sometime before you're 85, probably. But if you wait till you're 85, that'll be really bad. Because you don't want to have surgery when you're 85 years old, if you can help it. Certainly not the kind of surgery it takes to take out your thyroid. So I went there and I would decide I'd put it off until December 19th because my birthday's December 18th. And I wanted to be able to say I made it to 49 or whatever. So I said, I'll wait till after my birthday. In the first 6 months of that, nothing changed. Apparently in the next 3 months, it had grown. I hadn't noticed this at all. Mm-hmm. I went and had surgery. They took out half of it. The other half is still there and working fine, by the way. I don't have to take a pill or anything like that. It's great. I'm in the hospital room and the doctor comes in. I've got these things in my arm. They're gonna do whatever. They're talking to me. And the anesthesiologist says, your blood pressure's through the roof. Do you have high blood pressure? I said, no, but I'm terrified if that helps you at all. And the anesthetist, who's the nurse who supports the anesthesiologist, if I got that right, said, oh, don't worry about it. I've just put some stuff in your IV. You're going to be feeling pretty good in a couple minutes. And I remember turning and saying, well, I'm going to feel pretty good in a couple minutes. Next thing I know, there's this guy and he's moving my bed. And I have this, and he's talking to me and I have this distinct impression that I've met this guy and I should know what he's talking about, but I kind of just don't remember what just happened. And I look up and I see the tiles going by and I'm like, oh, it's just like in the movies where you see the tiles go by. Mm-hmm. And then I have this brief thought that I'm in an infinitely long warehouse and there's someone sitting next to me. And I remember thinking, oh, she's not talking to me. And then I'm back in the hospital bed. And in between the time where the tiles were going by and I got in the hospital bed, something like 5 hours had passed. Apparently it had grown so much that it was a 4.5 hour procedure instead of an hour-long procedure. Mm-hmm. I lost a neck size and a half. It was pretty big. Apparently it was as big as my heart. Why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this because
it's a hell of a story already.
Between tiles going by and me waking up in my hospital bed, no time passed. There was no sensation of time passing. When I go to sleep and I wake up in the morning, I have this feeling that time has passed, this feeling that something has physically changed about me. Nothing happened between the time they put the magic juice in me and the time that I woke up. Nothing. By the way, my wife was there with me talking. Apparently, I was also talking. I don't remember any of this, but luckily I didn't say anything I wouldn't normally say. My memory of it is I would talk to her and she would teleport around the room. And then I accused her of witchcraft and that was the end of that. But her point of view is I would start talking and then I would fall asleep and then I would wake up and leave off where I was before. I had no notion of any time passing. I kind of imagine that that's death.
Yeah.
Is the lack of sensation of time passing. And on the one hand, I am, soothed by the idea that I won't notice. On the other hand, I am very unhappy at the idea that I won't notice. So I don't know if I'm afraid of death, but I am completely sure that I don't like it and that I particularly would prefer to discover on my own whether immortality sucks and be able to make a decision about it. That's what I would prefer.
You have a choice in the matter.
Mm-hmm. I would like to have a choice in the matter.
Well, again, on the Russian thing, I think the finiteness of it is the thing that gives it a little flavor, a little spice. So,
well, in reinforcement learning, we believe that. That's why we have discount factors. Otherwise, it doesn't matter what you do.
Amen. Well, one last question, sticking on the Russian theme. You talked about your great grandparents, not remembering their name. What do you think is in this kind of Markov chain that is life? Mm-hmm. What do you think is the meaning of it all? What's the meaning of life?
Well, in a world where eventually you won't know who your great grandchildren are, I am reminded of something I heard once that I read once that I really like, which is, it is well worth remembering that the entire universe, save for one trifling exception, is composed entirely of others. And I think that's the meaning of life.
Charles, this was one of the best conversations I've ever had, and I get to see you tomorrow again to hang out with who looks to be one of the most how should I say, interesting personalities that I'll ever get to meet, with Michael Littman. So I can't wait. I'm excited to have had this opportunity. Thank you for traveling all the way here. It was amazing. I'm excited. I always loved Georgia Tech. I'm excited to see, with you being involved there, what the future holds. So thank you for talking today.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed every minute of it.
Thanks for listening to this conversation with Charles Isbell, and thank you to our sponsors, Neuro, the maker of functional sugar-free gum and mints that I used to give my brain a quick caffeine boost, Decoding Digital, a podcast on tech and entrepreneurship that I listen to and enjoy, Masterclass, online courses that I watch from some of the most amazing humans in history, and Cash App, the app I use to send money to friends for food and drinks. Please check out these sponsors in the description to get a discount and to support this podcast. If you enjoy this thing, subscribe on YouTube, review it with 5 stars on Apple Podcasts, follow on Spotify, support on Patreon, or connect with me on Twitter at Lex Fridman. And now let me leave you with some poetic words from Martin Luther King Jr. There comes a time when people get tired of being pushed out of the glittering sunlight of life's July and left standing amid the piercing chill of an alpine November. Thank you for listening, and hope to see you next time. Do you think about your own mortality? Do you think about your death? Your dad is no longer with us. You're the old wise sage that represents.
It's funny I've only worried about death once in this pandemic. Although I've had I had my cousin who was 73 and my uncle who's 74 die in India during the pandemic, and I grieve them both from COVID. Like the fear of COVID really has only hit me literally once during this. And it wasn't from me. And I recognize it's irrational. So on the eve of the Santa Clara County seroprevalence study, it was a really interesting thing because so many people volunteered to help. And my daughter, who's 20, I guess was 19 at the time, and my wife also volunteered to help with like various aspects of the study. And so the eve of the study, they were going to go out in public, and I didn't know what the death rate was because we hadn't done the study. Mm-hmm. And I suspected it was lower than people were saying, but I didn't know. I knew about the age gradient because I'd seen the Chinese data, mm-hmm. and my daughter's young, but my wife is my age, and I didn't know the death rate. And I couldn't sleep the night before. Like, what if I'm putting my family, my kid, my daughter and my wife at risk because of some activity that I'm doing? It was kind of, I don't know. I mean,
so it's worried about the well-being and of others.
Yeah.
Like when you look in the mirror,
if I die, I die. I mean, like it's not, again, I'm Christian, so death is not the end for me. I believe. And so I don't particularly worried about my own death, but I do. I mean, I think we can't help but we worry about the well-being of our loved ones.
So what is the role of fear in a pandemic? We've been dancing around it. Is it useful? Is it destructive? Or is there sort of a complicated story here? Because sort of taking us back into January 2020, there was so much uncertainty. This could have been a pandemic that is Black Death, the bubonic plague. It could have killed hundreds of millions of people. We don't know that. We're very new to this. It's been a while. We're rusty. So like there is some value to fear so that you don't do the stupid thing. You don't just go on living.
I guess where I come from, I think it's almost entirely counterproductive. I think fear should never be used as a tactic to manipulate human behavior by public health.
So the fear on the individual level that feeling of fear, you should be very hesitant about that feeling because it could be easily manipulated by the powerful.
Exactly. So I think that fear is natural, and it's not something that you have to stoke to get when the facts on the ground suggest it, right? In fact, the tendency for humans in the face of threats from infectious disease is to exaggerate the fear in their own minds of being contaminated by the environment and by others. That's just natural to humans. And the role of public health is not necessarily to eradicate the fear, but like obviously technological advances can help eradicate the fear, but it's really to help manage that fear and help people put the sort of incentives that come out of that to useful things as opposed to harmful things. What's happened in this pandemic is that there's been a deliberate policy to stoke the fear, to help make people think that the disease is worse than it actually is. In survey after survey, you see this. And that's been incredibly damaging. So young people have readily given away their willingness to participate in regular life because A, they fear COVID more than they ought, and B, they fear that they're going to harm the vulnerable in their lives. You put those two together and you get this powerful demand for lockdowns. You see this all over the world.
Broadly speaking, you have a powerful demand for irrational policies, irrational policies, because I would like to mention the flip side of that. I've been saddened to see how much money there is to be made by the martyrs, the people, the conspiracy theorists that tell you should be afraid of the government. You should be afraid of the man. It feels like fear is the problem. I think there's some guy that once said something about we should fear itself. He was a president or something.
I vaguely remember that.
So I'm worried about both sides here. I
think the general principle is that should not be a tool of public policy. Right. The public policy should attempt, and public health policy in particular should attempt to address that fear. It's not that you should tell people lies. Of course not. Tell people accurately what the risk is. Give people tools that have evidence that they can address their risk with, and level with people when we don't know. I think that is the right adult way to deal with this pandemic from a public health point of view. And that is not the policy we have followed. Instead, public health has intentionally stoked the fear in order to gain compliance with its edicts. And I think the consequence of that is people distrust public health. What you're talking about, the distrust of government, I think is partly a consequence of that. That movement, which is much smaller once upon a time, is much larger now. Because of essentially, people look at what public health has done and said, I mean, they've lied to me a whole bunch of times and a whole bunch of things is the general sense, and there are consequences to that. We're going to have to work in public health for a long time to try to regain the trust of the public.
So thinking back to that fear, is there things you're afraid of now that you're not doing, you're afraid to do?
I'm afraid of all kinds of things. I'm afraid of not being good at my job, not being funny, letting people down, not putting out products that are good, whether it's the podcast every week or stand up or the videos. Like I'm afraid of there's a ton of people that really enjoy what we do. So when you're in that position, you're nervous that you're going to start doing things that they don't like. So the new things you want to do, the evolution you want to do, you want to make sure you're evolving in the right way. Yeah. You want to make sure that you're doing things that are consistent with why people liked you. But also you don't want to put yourself in a box and limit what you can be going forward. So I had a talk with the CEO of NBC Universal once. I was doing some internal sketch for them. And I was playing like a cab driver, and he was and he's not the current CEO, but he's a former CEO. And I said to him, what's the hardest part of running a corporation of this size? And he said something very interesting. He said, the hardest part is maximizing the current profit model of what you have at the same time, getting the company ready for where it's going to be in 5 years. Mm-hmm. He said, those are often at odds. And that's the toughest thing. He goes, because I could just bang out everything I got to do right now, and we're going to make a lot of money doing this. but am I devoting enough resources into digital so that in 5 years, when that's where everything lives, are we competitive in that space? So as funny as I am now, hopefully to people and a lot of the things that I want to do now, I'm going, what groundwork am I not laying for 3 to 5 years down the road so that I can be adapting to the trends that are important then in terms of not so much comedic trends, but like the technological trends. Like what is, I should have done podcasting earlier.
Mm-hmm.
What should I have a bigger presence on TikTok? Should I have a bigger presence here? Should I be on Twitch? Should I be doing this? Should I be doing that? What am I not doing that I should be doing that I'll regret not doing? And those are the conversations I think I have in my own head all the time.
And I guess there's parallels to coming out as gay, or just parallels in like career paths you're taking, all that. That's ultimately just fear.
It's fear.
Yeah.
It's the fear of, the best thing that happened in my career was that I came to LA. I didn't have an idea of what was going to happen. I met somebody who was really committed to making funny things. Mm-hmm. That we just wanted to be funny. No one would let us be funny. We didn't have Comedy Central letting us be funny. We didn't have HBO. We didn't have Netflix. We just had a garage and a phone in the beginning, and then a camera, and then a thing. And we just wanted to be funny. And that was the greatest risk really I took, because I was like, well, I don't know what else is going to happen right now, but I just want to be funny. And funny saved my life, right? I mean, funny got me out of drugs. Funny probably got me out of the closet. Funny was the thing that I was able to do that made everything okay in my own head. So I was like, as long as I'm being funny, something good will happen. So we did that. And then something really cool happened, that we were able to do a lot of cool things. But, that's what it is. It's fear that keeps you from being the better version of yourself.
You mentioned going back to darkness. I'm Russian, so I like going back to darkness. You suffered from depression. You considered suicide. Do you ponder your own death these days? Do you think about your own mortality? Are you afraid of death?
I definitely think about mortality. And am I afraid of my own death? It depends on the moment. If I'm in the middle of a project, I definitely want to finish that project, man. Yeah. But I don't fear it so much. I fear leaving my kids or my wife and not being able to be there for them. That bothers me. Outside of that, I know that I put everything into the life that I've lived. Like I said, there's always more, but like I've lived hard. I've loved hard.
Yeah.
Every moment in my life, I've made connections and impacted people around me for the better. And this tracks back, which is crazy, when we were doing the documentary and they're interviewing people through my whole life, and the consistency of the themes of anyone, like anything for Duffin, like just, sure, I'll fly in from Boston, all the, like these people, like all like, it was crazy. Like everybody had a story about me giving, like just over and over. And I didn't even really,
it's just the way you were. Yeah.
But I've been all in. I don't have I have a lot more I want to do, but I don't have things that regret have not done in I don't fear it. I don't fear it.
Yeah, it's like I don't know if you know the Bukowski poem, "Go all the way. Otherwise, don't even try." It seems like you embody that poem, and you've accomplished some incredible things and serve as an inspiration to a huge number of people. Chris, you're an amazing human being. I'm really honored that you would spend your valuable time with me. Thank you so much for talking with me today. It was incredible. I can't wait to check out all the cool stuff you've engineered with Kabuki Strength. So I'm obviously I love strength. I love strength training. I love the idea of strength. I love the equipment and the engineering approach that you take to strength. You're an incredible human, both on the things you've accomplished in terms of your own strength feats and the kind of science and engineering you bring to the field that many others could use. So thank you so much for talking today.
Thanks for having me on. That was that's quite the final. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this conversation with Chris Duffin, and thank you to Headspace, Magic Spoon, Sunbasket, and Ladder. Check them out in the description to support this podcast. And now, let me leave you with some words from Arnold Schwarzenegger. Strength does not come from winning. Your struggles develop your strengths. When you go through hardship and decide not to surrender, that is strength. Thank you for listening, and hope to see you next time. A lot of people have sci-fi inspired fears of walking robots like those from Boston Dynamics. If you just look at shows on Netflix and so on, or flying robots like those you work with. How do you think about those fears? How would you alleviate those fears? Do you have inklings, echoes of those same concerns?
Anytime we develop a technology meaning to have positive impact in the world, there's always the worry that somebody could subvert those technologies and use it in an adversarial setting. And robotics is no exception, right? So I think it's very easy to weaponize robots. I think we talk about swarms. One thing I worry a lot about is, for us to get swarms to work and do something reliably, it's really hard. But suppose I have this challenge of trying to destroy something, and I have a swarm of robots. Well, only one out of the swarm needs to get to its destination. So that suddenly becomes a lot more doable. And so I worry about, this general idea of using autonomy with lots and lots of agents. I mean, having said that, look, a lot of this technology is not very mature. My favorite saying is that if somebody had to develop this technology, wouldn't you rather the good guys do it? So the good guys have a good understanding of the technology so they can figure out how this technology is being used in a bad way or could be used in a bad way and try to defend against it. So we think a lot about that. So we're doing research on how to defend against swarms, for example.
That's interesting.
There's in fact a report by the National Academies on counter UAS technologies. This is a real threat. But we're also thinking about how to defend against this and knowing how swarms work, knowing how autonomy works is, I think, very important.
So it's not just politicians. You think engineers have a role in this discussion?
Absolutely. I think the days where politicians can be agnostic to technology are gone. I think every politician needs to be literate in technology. And I often say technology is the new liberal art. Mm-hmm. Understanding how technology will change your life, I think, is important. And every human being needs to understand that.
And maybe we can elect some engineers to office as well on the other side. I want to talk to you about freedom here in the context of something you've mentioned, which one way to take away freedom is to put a human being into a cage, is to create constraints. The other one that worries me is something that I think you've spoken to Twitter a little bit on Twitter is we bleed freedom by kind of slowly scaring you into not expressing the full spectrum of opportunities you can as freedom. So like when you ban Donald Trump, when you ban Parler, you give a little doubt in the minds of millions, like me, a person who's a tech person, who's an entrepreneur. There's a little, that's what I'm afraid of when I look in the mirror. Is there now a little doubt in there?
Sure.
That limits the amount of options I will try.
How certain are you that the COVID virus didn't come from the Wuhan lab and is biosafety level 4? We both know that we're both supposed to robotically say, the idea that the COVID virus came from a lab is a discredited conspiracy theory. There is no evidence that suggests that this is true. The World Health Organization and the CDC have both opined this. To say otherwise would be incredibly irresponsible.
And the threat of that is the thing that ultimately limits the freedoms. If we could take a step back to the discussion about fear a little bit. So Mike Tyson talks about this process of him walking to the ring. He sounds similar to you in many ways, of the anxiety and the fear that he experiences. And he has this sort of story that he tells about walking to the ring and being supremely afraid, But as he walks and gets closer and steps in, he finds the confidence and becomes supremely confident. I think he calls himself like a god. I feel like a god in the ring. Do you go through a similar process of finding the confidence?
Well, yes, and I use James Lange theory. So what I do is, because I'm not afraid to admit that I'm afraid. And in the beginning of my career, I really thought, I asked myself, because I was very good in mixed martial art, but I really thought I wasn't made for this, because the idea of fighting didn't make me happy. It's something like I was forced to do in order to keep that lifestyle that I have and achieve my goal, perhaps one day to make enough money to retire. And, that was my dream. But when I was looking around the gym where I was training, most of my training partners, they were happy. They were excited. And sometimes I corner a lot of guys and they're happy and they're in the locker room. They don't react the same way I do. Some perhaps does, but if you see me in the locker room, like when I get, like my last fight with Michael Bisping, just to give you an example, in my last fight with Michael Bisping, because it's fresh, it's the one that is the most recent, but it's always the same thing. My last fight in Bisping, I get in the locker room, I had like 3 guys that I train with: Mickey Gall, Eamon Zahabi, and Joseph Duffy. They all lost. It was my locker room was basically cursed. When you're in a locker room and people from your locker room leave for a fight and then they come back, it's kind of a momentum. You shake and, yeah, good job. Now it's my turn. It's kind of a team brotherhood sort of thing. So the the atmosphere in my locker room was pretty bad. It was like going to a funeral. So I was very scared, and before every fight, I ask myself always, shit, what the hell I'm doing here? Why did I choose to come back? Oh my God, and I'm freaking out. However, I'm putting on a mask, like I'm acting, because if I don't do that, it will reflect on my coaches, and if my coach, the confidence of my coaches is affected, it will reflect on me. So I need to feel strong. I need to make them believe that I'm excited to be there and I'm happy to be there. So this sort of play start when I first step in the locker room, even though I feel completely different, but that's how I play it. Normally, the fight day, I never feel 100%. I always feel exhausted, tired. My eyes are hitching because I don't sleep enough the few nights before, because I'm constantly rehearsing scenarios that might happen in the fight. So mentally, it's not that I'm not on top.
But you keep all that to yourself.
I keep it to myself, and I'm lying to everybody around me. But everybody knows, Ferraz, John Danaher, they know Freddie Roche, because they've been with me for a long time, so they know what's going on. But at least I'm lying to them. I'm like, hey, I'm feeling great. So, and seeing all my training partner like very disappointed because they lost their fight. Some were badly hurt as well. It was hard. So, and I remember I start the warm up and everything. And as you start the warm up, you become a different person. Mm-hmm. Because, we know that certain posture in yoga can affect your mental state. But I would say it's a little bit the same thing in fighting. Like when you start hitting the pads, your muscle memory, your instincts comes back, and you remember that you're good at this, and your confidence start to grow. And as seeing your trainers holding the pad and repeating your moves, it makes you also remember all the sacrifice you have done through your training camp. And confidence comes from how you prepared yourself. And even you're afraid, you can be confident in the same time. Being afraid and being confident is two different things. And before every fight, just right before I walk in, it's when I'm scared, I go in the bathroom and I look at myself in the mirror. I used to have a bandana and a gi, but now it no more. I didn't have this for my last fight because of the new Reebok deal they had. But I did the same rehearsal that I always do. I look at myself in the mirror and I start to compliment myself. Like, even if I don't believe it, I'm trying to believe it as I am. I'm finding all the reason why I'm going to win the fight. And all my trainer knows that before every fight, when the guy from the UFC goes and step in my room and says, St. Pierre, you're up next, I always take a few minutes to do that same rehearsal. And I tell myself, I'm going to win this fight because I'm better. And I'm very cocky about myself. I'm telling all the reasons that why I'm going to win. I got a better team. I made more sacrifice, you know. I'm faster, I'm more powerful, way more athletic. My fighting IQ is better than him. I got a strategy on point that he's never gonna be able to keep up with, and this and that. And I was telling myself, hey, I'm gonna show these young kids how things should be done. You know, trying to boost myself. Yeah. Try to boost yourself, and you start to believe in it. You become a different person. So when you walk out the bathroom, now rock and roll. Now I really believe it for real, you know, like I'm still scared, but I believe it for real. And that's the transformation that happened for me right there. And from there to the fight, it's until the fight is over, I call it cruise control. Because you don't have time to think in a fight. If you're trying to think, you're missing the opportunity. So that's how I see it for myself.
So at that point, you stop thinking and you just go cruise control, autopilot.
Trust yourself, you know. Trust yourself because you repeated all the scenarios, you know. So everything that you have done, it's inside your computer. Your computer, your brain is programmed to react accordingly to certain situations. And it's not the night of the fight that you'll tell yourself, oh, finally I'm gonna do this if you do this. No. If you have not practiced it before, you're screwed. The preparation, the repetition that makes it happen. You know?
To optimize.
So Ernest Becker, I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, the philosopher. He wrote the book Denial of Death, and his idea is that one of the core motivations of human beings is our terror of death, our fear of death. That's what makes us unique from cats. Cats are just surviving. They do not have a deep cognizance, introspection that over the horizon is the end. And he says that, there's a terror management theory, that's just all these psychological experiments that show basically this idea that all of human civilization, everything we create is kind of trying to forget, even for a brief moment, that we're going to die. When do you think humans understand that they're going to die? Is it learned early on also?
I don't know at what point. It's a question at what point do you realize that, what death really is? And I think most people don't actually realize what death is, right? Most people believe that you go to heaven or something, right?
Well, to push back on that, what Ernest Becker says and Sheldon Solomon, all of those folks, and I find those ideas a little bit compelling, is that there is moments in life, early in life, a lot of this fun happens early in life when you do deeply experience the terror of this realization and all the things you think about religion, all those kinds of things that we kind of think about more like teenage years and later. We're talking about way earlier.
No, it's like 7 or 8 years, something like that. Yeah.
You realize, holy crap, this is like the mystery, the terror. Like it's almost like you're a little prey, a little baby deer sitting in the darkness of the jungle, of the woods, looking all around you. There's darkness full of terror. That realization says, okay, I'm going to go back in the comfort of my mind where there is a deep meaning, where there is maybe like pretend I'm immortal in however kind of idea I can construct to help me understand that I'm immortal. Religion helps with that. But you can delude yourself in all kinds of ways, like lose yourself in the busyness of each day, have little goals in mind, all those kinds of things, to think that it's going to go on forever. And you kind of know you're going to die, yeah, and it's going to be sad, but you don't really understand that you're going to die. And so that's their idea. And I find that compelling because it does seem to be a core unique aspect of human nature, that we're able to think that we're able to really understand that this life is finite. That seems important.
There's a bunch of different things there. So first of all, I don't think there is a qualitative difference between us and cats in the term. I think the difference is that we just have a better long-term ability to predict, in the long term, and so we have a better understanding of how the world works. So we have better understanding of finiteness of life and things like that.
So we have a better planning engine than cats.
Yeah.
Okay.
But
what's the motivation for planning that
well,
far?
I think it's just a side effect of the fact that we have just a better planning engine because it makes us, as I said, the essence of intelligence is the ability to predict. And so because we're smarter, as a side effect, we also have this ability to kind of make predictions about our own future existence or lack thereof.
Okay.
You say religion helps with that. I think religion hurts, actually. It makes people worry about, what's going to happen after their death, etc. If you believe that, you just don't exist after death, it solves completely the problem.
Wait,
At least
you're saying if you don't believe in God, you don't worry about what happens after death?
Yeah.
I don't know.
You only worry about this life because that's the only one you have.
I think it's I don't know. If I were to say what Ernest Becker says, and I would say I agree with him more than not, is you do deeply worry. If you believe there's no God, there's still a deep worry, of the mystery of it all. How does that make any sense? That it just ends. I don't think we can truly understand that this ride. I mean, so much of our life, the consciousness, the ego, is invested in this being, and then
science keeps bringing humanity down from its pedestal, and that's just another example of it.
That's wonderful, but for us individual humans, we don't like to be brought down from a pedestal.
You're fine saying
what? But see, you're fine with it because, so what Ernest Becker would say is you're fine with it because that's just a more peaceful existence for you, but you're not really fine. You're hiding from it. In fact, some of the people that experience the deepest trauma earlier in life, they often, before they seek extensive therapy, will say that I'm fine. It's like when you talk to people who are truly angry, how are you doing? I'm fine. The question is, what's going on?
Now, I had a near-death experience. I had a very bad motorbike accident when I was 17. So, but that didn't have any impact on my reflection on that topic.
So I'm basically just playing a bit of a devil's advocate and pushing back on wondering, is it truly possible to accept death? And the flip side that's more interesting, I think, for AI and robotics is how important is it to have this as one of the suite of motivations, is to not just avoid falling off the roof or something like that, but ponder the end of the ride. If you listen to the Stoics, it's a great motivator. It adds a sense of urgency. So it might be to truly fear death or be cognizant of it might give a deeper meaning and urgency to the moment to live fully.
Maybe I don't disagree with that. I think what motivates me here is knowing more about human nature. I think human nature and human intelligence is a big mystery. It's a scientific mystery. Mm-hmm. In addition to philosophical and etc. But I'm a true believer in science. So and I do have kind of a belief that for complex systems like the brain and the mind, the way to understand it is to try to reproduce it with artifacts that you build, because what's essential to it when you try to build it. The same way, I've used this analogy before with you, I believe, the same way we only started to understand aerodynamics when we started building airplanes, and that helped us understand how birds fly. So I think there's kind of a similar process here where we don't have a full theory of intelligence, but building, intelligent artifacts will help us perhaps develop some, underlying theory that encompasses not just artificial implements, but also human and biological intelligence in general.
So you're an interesting person to ask this question about sort of all kinds of different other intelligent entities or intelligences. What are your thoughts about kind of like the Turing or the Chinese room question? if we create an AI system that exhibits a lot of properties of intelligence and consciousness, motivator. So you don't think, you think that's an artifact of evolution? So that's the kind of mind space evolution created, that we're sort of almost obsessed about self-preservation at some kind of genetic level. You don't think that's necessary to be afraid of death? So not just a kind of sub goal of self-preservation just so you can keep doing the thing, but more fundamentally sort of have the finite thing, like this ends for you at some point.
Interesting. Do I think it's necessary for what precisely?
For intelligence, but also for consciousness. So for both, do you think really like a finite death and the fear of it is important?
So before I can answer, before we can agree on whether it's necessary for intelligence or for consciousness, we should be clear on how we define those two words, because a lot of really smart people define them in very different ways.
Right.
I was on this panel with AI experts, and they couldn't agree on how to define intelligence even. So I define intelligence simply as the ability to accomplish complex goals. I like a broad definition because, again, I don't want to be a carbon chauvinist.
Right.
And in that case, no, certainly it doesn't require fear of death. I would say Alpha Zero is quite intelligent.
Right.
I don't think Alpha Zero has any fear of being turned off because it doesn't understand the concept of it even. And similarly, consciousness, I mean, you could certainly imagine very simple kind of experience. If certain plants have any kind of experience, I don't think they're very afraid of dying, because there's nothing they can do about it anyway much. So there wasn't that much value in. But more seriously, I think if you ask not just about being conscious, but maybe having what we might call an exciting life, where you feel passion and really appreciate the things. Maybe perhaps it does help having that backdrop that, hey, it's finite. Let's make the most of this. Let's live to the fullest. So, I mean, if you knew you were going to just live forever, do you think you would change your?
Yeah, I mean, in some perspective, it would be an incredibly boring life, living forever. So, in the sort of loose, subjective terms that you said of something exciting and something in this that other humans would understand, I think is, it seems that the finiteness of it is important.
Well, the good news I have for you then is, based on what we understand about cosmology, everything is, universe is ultimately probably finite. Although
Big Crunch or big what's the infinite?
Yeah, we could have a big chill or a big crunch or a big rip or the big snap or death bubbles. All of them are more than 1 billion years away. So we certainly have vastly more time than our ancestors thought. But they're still pretty hard to squeeze in an infinite number of compute cycles, even though there are some loopholes that just might be possible. But I think, some people like to say that you should live as if you're going to die in 5 years or so, and that's sort of optimal. Maybe it's a good assumption. We should build our civilization as if it's all finite, to be honest.
Change.
Are you, as a young mind, do you have a sense of fear about just like how afraid were you to do this podcast conversation? Do you have a sense of fear of thinking publicly?
Yeah, I don't even think that fear is irrational. It's very difficult to exist publicly in any form now, because it's very easy for anyone to take cheap shots at something which is difficult. And as I said, the people who are trying to have the difficult ideas and conversations are perhaps putting others in actual danger, because everyone is so desperate that they might be willing to try anything. So there's a certain amount of responsibility which one has to take going before the public, and there is a certain amount of ridicule which will be completely unwarranted that anyone must endure for it. And I think that means that one has to be afraid, because they could both ruin the world and be ruined by the world in an unwarranted and undeserved fashion. I would like to believe in myself enough to try to accept this as a task, because I think people need to try, or there's no getting out of this, and we will end in some kind of crazy, brilliant war.
Is this terrifying to you, by the way? This world that we're living in, as we put more and more of ourselves on the internet, into the metaverse, that there's so many more attack vectors on our well-being.
What's terrifying to me, I used to preach it on Shadow Crew, is the idea that the perception of truth is more important than the truth itself. It doesn't matter what the facts are. It matters what I can convince you of.
Yeah.
That's what's terrifying to me. So you look at deep fakes, you look at fake news, all the stuff that's going out, that becomes truly terrifying.
Maybe there's an angle where it's freeing if nothing is true and you can't trust anything.
But you see, we as human beings, we want to trust. We do. We need human interaction. And for that human interaction, you have to have a degree of trust.
But it's more like you let go of an idea of absolute truth, and it more becomes like a blockchain style consensus. So you let go of, like, you know what? There's this human dream. You get this on the internet. You get like facts, as if there's at the bottom, there's one turtle that's holding this like scroll that says, these are the truths of the world. The problem is, I mean, maybe believing that is counterproductive. Maybe human civilization is an ongoing process of consensus. And so it's always going to be, everything is shrouded in, you can call them lies, or you can call them inaccuracies, or you can call them delusions. It's constantly going to be a sea of lies and delusions. But our hope is to, over time, develop bigger and bigger islands of consensus that allows us to live a stable and happy society. Don't call it true. Call it a stable consensus that creates a high quality of life for the inhabitants of the island.
I like it. I like it. We're going to agree.
And then don't use Outlook. No, I'm just kidding. So maybe step back. You mentioned, I'd love to talk about Shadow Crew. Maybe this is the right time to actually, let's go to Shadow Crew, because it's such a fascinating story. So tell me the story of building Shadow Crew, the precursor to today's darknet and darknet markets. This is why you're the original Godfather.
This is it.
So we talked about love. Let me ask you the other question I'm obsessed with. Are you, do you ponder your own mortality?
I do, a lot. Especially now that I'm an uncle, especially now that I have like these younger people that I mentor. I was just yesterday, my friend John Gerges, who did my theme song for my podcast, who did the book cover for Dear Reader, who's like the most talented person I know, his song came on the iPod at the gym. And I almost messaged him. I go, one day one of us is going to bury the other and it's going to be really sad. And I thought about that. And it was kind of just like, oh man, that's really going to suck. I don't know which scenario would be better. Like, I will be very just sad if he's gone. I'm sure he'll be very sad if I'm gone.
I mean, are you afraid of it?
No. Rand had this quote about how I won't die, the world will end. So I've had enough experiences that I've really, at this point, and everything's icing on the cake.
So if I were to kill you at the end of this podcast, it feels painless. That would be okay?
Yeah. You know why?
Does anyone know you're here, by the way?
You know why?
Just asking for a friend.
Here's why.
Yeah.
There's that wit. Save that for Twitter, Lex. Do they call you Sasha?
No, I'm Lyosha.
Lyosha. Oh, that's my sister's husband. Okay. So here's why. I strongly believe, and this is a very kind of Jewish perspective, that you just have to leave the world a little bit better than you found it. That all you could do is move the needle a little. And one of the things I set out to do with Dear Reader, my book on North Korea, I was at a point in my career where I could do something to make a difference instead of just writing like co-authoring books with celebrities, which I'm very proud of, but are neither here nor there. And I thought, all right, I know how to tell stories. I know how to inform people. I know how to entertain people. If I move the needle in America, who cares? We got it really good here. If I move the needle in North Korea a little bit, the cost benefits through the roof.
I never thought of that, actually. I never thought of D-Reader from that perspective.
When I set out to write it,
Wow.
I'm like, okay, what can I do? I'm not going to be able to liberate the North Korean regime. What I can do is the camera right now is focused on, at the time, Kim Jong-il, now Kim Jong-un. And I can do just this a little bit. And I go, behind that guy who you think is funny clown, there's millions of dead people. There's children being starved. There's people who are performing because they have a gun to their kid's head. And if someone put a gun to your kid's head, you'd put on those dancing shoes real quick. And I and others have managed to change the conversation about North Korea in terms of look at those silly buffoons to those poor people. So the fact that that little thing I can say with a straight face, I did, doesn't make me a great person, but it does make me someone who, if I have to go tomorrow, I can say I did a little bit to make the world a better place.